This is pretty geeky stuff, what we're going to look at today. Okay, so there's a few assumptions here. One is that you kind of already understand what I do. You know about my farm. My name is Curtis Stone. I believe all of you have my book now. So you've got a good reference there. And if some of this is over your head, then that's okay, because you're all going to get a recording of it. And I think Diego offered the video for an extra $100 or something too, so you'll have that as well, and you got the book as a reference. What I want to do here today, and this is sort of my objective with all of my workshops I teach, my primary objective is to deliver the most amount of value to the most amount of you in the shortest period of time. And in order to do that, we're going to have to kind of focus on how we run the day, or this 3-hour session. I'm going to take questions in blocks. I'm not going to take questions as we go. That does a couple things. It kind of forces you to have more concise questions, which will help everybody get more value out of this workshop. And it'll also limit your questions to actual questions and not stories, because we all have stories. And sometimes the stories are better saved for the breaks than they are for the actual session, because, like I said, my objective is to give you guys the most amount of value in the shortest period of time to the most of you. So we'll need to be concise with all this stuff. One thing I'll say before we start, I have an online course that is a very extensive encyclopedia of everything I do. There's a few people here today in the online course. I have a discount code for anybody who decides if they think you'd like to take it at some point. You just sign up, put in PV3, you'll get $100 off the course, so that's available to all of you. And there's my book and some social media stuff if any of you need it. So this is a new type of workshop. This is the first time I've done this. I made a video for this a while ago, and it's been available on my website for a while, but I actually have updated this a little bit to make it a more concise for the day. And what we're going to do essentially is we're going to go through a farm plan, this is going to be a week-by-week play-by-play of a season. Once we get into the main season of the farm, we're going to kind of skip the summer, because once we get into summertime in June, I'm pretty much planting the same things consistently. But what we're going to look at is a quarter-acre farm on how you could make $80,000 on a quarter acre. This is growing a specific group of crops. So we're specializing a little bit, but I'm showing this to you because I want to just demonstrate the potential with these kind of systems. If we're focusing in on markets and we're focusing in on specific crops, what the profit potential is. 80,000 that we're going to look at today is actually just a kind of a broad benchmark. This could actually be a lot more, especially if you were to do more microgreens and kind of tweak things here and there. There's quite a bit more potential on where it can go. This is the primary concept that you'll need to understand in order to get value out of this workshop. In my book, I have 2 categories of land, high rotation and birotation. Birotation is irrelevant for the day. We're only going to talk about high rotation. This means that every single bed on the farm will be rotated multiple times in the season. On average 4. In the case of the greenhouses that we're going to look at, it'll be 3. In some field blocks, it might even be more than 4. But $800 per bed, which is a 30-inch by 25-foot bed, is the average revenue that each bed will generate on the farm. So that's the primary concept that you need to understand when we go into this. So we are rotating these beds by focusing on quick-growing crops and having multiple successions of those crops. How I amend the soil and all that we'll look at throughout this session. And we'll kind of just go. You're going to see a timestamp of each week as we go through, and we'll just go from there. So if there's something on the screen that you see you don't understand at all and it's relevant that might help people here understand, feel free to ask that. But I'm going to just take questions in blocks. We might do 2 question blocks. I'm just going to kind of leave it open and just kind of read your body language and then kind of figure, okay, it's time to do questions. We'll do about 10 minutes. We might do about 2 10-minute blocks depending on what everybody is feeling. And if I see anybody nodding off, then I'll say, we'll stop for a few minutes, we'll stand up, we'll shake out, and then we'll come and sit back down. But I'm going to throw a ton of information at you in a short period of time, so let's go for it. So before I start into this specific session, there's a couple things that I'd like you guys to understand. These are the foundational principles of how I manage my farm, even how I manage my life. They are all based on 80%. There's two concepts. This is the first one, the Pareto principle. The rule of 80-20, meaning that 80% of 20% of your causes will yield 80% of your effects. This is your products, your customers, the service, your efforts. Everything you do on your farm will often look like that. So that you've heard the old cliche, 20% of your customers will bring you 80% of your business. 20% of your products will be 80% of your revenues. 20% of your efforts will be 80% of your results. So these are the things that are foundational to my farm. The success of my farm is entirely based on this principle, and one other I'll show you in a second. But it's all about doubling down on the things that are the most effective, and then minimizing, reducing, streamlining the things that aren't. So when we're talking about crops and customers and services, the 20% that gives us the 80% of our yield is where we concentrate our efforts. We'll do everything we can to double down on those things. So if one particular crop I'm noticing that I'm selling a lot of and there's more demand for it, I'm going to double down. I might not necessarily double that literally, but what I mean is I'm going to increase more of that, and I'm going to look at the weak points of my products and say, okay, I'm going to minimize those. Some I might eliminate entirely, or I'll streamline them to the point where they can be done almost effortlessly. This is foundational to how our farm functions, and this is how it's possible to make this kind of money on such a small land base. But it really comes down to looking at numbers. So I'm going to be doing another workshop on spreadsheets later in the week, I believe on Saturday in the afternoon session. And that will be more looking at those numbers and how they correlate to making your farm more successful. But basically what we're looking at today is assuming that we're doubling down and concentrating on the things that are the most profitable. We're going to look at a select group of crops that this farm plan is going to be specifically focused on. And again, or just keep in mind here, what I'm showing you guys, and I say this in all my workshops and lectures, is I'm not here to stand here and say this is the ultimate way to do things. This is the only way to do it. This is just how I do it. It's what works for me. It works within my context. And the context is really key here because your context might be slightly different. And I know we all live in different places. We have different market streams. We have different products, different climates. And so keep in mind that it's all about context. And just look at this as a framework. It's just a benchmark you can use, and you might modify it to your own situation. That's really key to understand. One thing I didn't mention there is research and development. So as far as when we double down on the 20% that give us 80% yield, we can use that as research and development. As far as customers go, your core customer group, say it's that 20% of people that shop at your farmer's market and they're the ones that are bringing you all the business, that's your R&D team. Those people, if you deliver more value to them through just communicating to them, getting to know them, giving them gardening advice, giving them farming advice, those customers you get to know on somewhat of a personal level, that's your R&D team. Anytime I try new products, I'll bring 10 bags of something to a market and I'll give it to those customers. Say, hey, let me know what you think about that next week. I'm constantly looking at how I can increase and offer more value to that 20%. It's really fundamental to understand because it isn't just about products, it isn't just about services, it's about people. It's about extending your efforts to those people that deliver you the most amount of value and offering them the most amount of value. This is really key. So everything in here, in this 80%, I'm going to mitigate, eliminate, streamline, or make things done so quickly that they require very little effort. And this whole farm plan we're going to look at today is based on this because there's a lot of stuff we're not doing. There's a lot of crops I'm not growing here. This is focused, it's specialized. So the other aspect of this 80% is about where can you achieve the highest amount of effort in the shortest period of time? And this is a concept where basically 80% will bring you can get to 80% if your time is on the bottom here. You can get in 50% of the time, you can get to 80% of the quality. One perfect example of that is take a glass of water under the tap and flip the tap on, it'll fill up really quickly, but most of it up here is just foam, right? It's bubbly. So in order to get to the very top, you got to slow the tap down and get it right to the top. This exists in everything. It exists in nature, it exists in human systems, it exists in our efforts. So what we're looking at here with this system, and everything I do on my farm, is settling for 80%, because in most cases, 80% is good enough. If I'm bagging salad greens and I'm bagging 4-ounce bags for the farmer's market, 4.6 ounces is good enough, 5 ounces is good enough, sometimes 6 ounces is good enough, 3.9 ounces is good enough. Good enough, good enough, good enough. To be a perfectionist will take you a lot more effort. If you can settle for 80%, and that number will vary from farm to farm or situation to situation. It might be 85, it might be 90. But where is that sweet spot where you're getting the most amount of value for the least amount of effort in the shortest period of time? That's what this is all about. And this is something we do on our farm all the time. We're not striving to be perfectionists ever. That is usually not worth the time, because most people won't even reach perfection anyways. If you're constantly trying to be exact with everything you do, you will waste a lot of time. So I wanted to open up with those because they're totally paramount to everything I do on my farm. And they're key to making a system like this that I'm going to show you today on how we can get these kind of numbers off such a small land base. So the basic thing we're going to look at is a small piece of land and how this could be mimicked in many different contexts. So this could be urban, this could be rural, it doesn't matter. In North America, this is the average size lot of a home. So this is US and Canada. Average lot size is 8,000 square feet. Average home size is 2,400 square feet. That means that every home in America, on average, so obviously I'm not talking about high-density urban areas like New York City, and I'm not talking about extreme areas with rural areas where people are living on an acre. We're talking about the average of everything combined. That we've got around 2,000 square feet of growing space on the average home in North America, right? So generally, we're talking about medium-density homes and things like this. There's this much available land on those lots. If we're looking at a high rotation system, which is what we're talking about today, that means that the average home, if I were to form out some standardized beds like I use on my farm, 30-inch beds, these are 50 feet long, so they would yield $1,600 per bed. That means that the average home in an 8-month growing season, which is average in North America, could generate $27,000 of revenue on a suburban lot. Okay, so the potential with this is quite huge when you think about how many people live in medium density areas in the US. So a high rotation means that we're going to be planting multiple times. We're going to have multiple turnovers of the same beds. Keep in mind, a lot of what you're going to see today, these crops are low feeders. They actually barely draw anything from the soil. But I'm going to show you how I amend my soil and how I build my soil as I go. It's low-till or no-till techniques and high amounts of organic matter. That each bed, so if it's a 30-inch by 25-foot bed, could make $800 in a season on average. That's a conservative average. I came to that number by tracking all of the harvests and the yields from my beds in my farm for 6 years. And when I put this in my book, I took arugula, salad greens, radishes, all the high rotation, quick growing crops, and I came up with an average. What's the average that I yield per bed? So that's factoring in irrigation failures, pest problems, weather anomalies, everything. So in most cases, if all things go well, you can almost double that number in high rotation beds. But we're not going to look at the high best case scenario. We always want to look at the conservative average, because that's your best case, that's your most likely case scenario. So a quarter acre farm in that sense can look like this. Here's 3 plots that I've farmed on, and we can configure these beds however we like. Some beds might be 50 feet long, some beds are 25 feet long, the odd bed might be 30 feet long. It depends on how you configure it. But the most important thing to know is that we're going to essentially, for the sake of this workshop, we're going to essentially just assume that we've got 4 blocks of land on average 25 feet long. That's just how we're going to view it, because it's going to simplify the presentation. We're essentially going to be looking at a topographic map that is all of these blocks of land, which could be arranged however. The arrangement isn't really that important. It's just the fact that we've got these beds, and they're going to be divided up in this plot some way or another. It doesn't matter exactly what beds are at what plot. It doesn't matter how many plots you have. The most important thing to understand is that we're going to look at 100 standardized beds and how a season plays out with this kind of production. So to break it down further, what we're going to do is we've got 4 blocks. So all of these are high rotation, meaning that each bed will be rotated many times in the season, but we're going to have 2 of the blocks are going to be just field. So these 2 blocks will be open. There'll be no season extension on them. This block here will have poly low tunnels. So these are movable tunnels that I'll bounce around even from plot to plot, and you'll see how I do that. So there's season extension here. The season on these beds is longer than the other ones. The blocks 1 and 2, the primary season for those blocks is May till October, near the end of October. Block 3 will be March until November. And then the high rotation areas, which are in the greenhouses, have tomatoes in there as their primary crop for the main part of the season, and then crops on the shoulder. Those beds will actually be year-round in a way, because we can have overwintered crops in them, and we can push the season. Mainly, we're going to look at March till the end of October and just discuss at the very end what going into November looks like. But it's important to understand that these ones are almost year-round. So these are unheated polytunnels that have cold-tolerant crops in them on the shoulder season and the winter, and then they're going to have a primary crop of tomatoes in them. But those are even going to be interplanted, and they're going to cross over their time with the quick-growing, cool-weather crops in the shoulder seasons. And we're going to break all of that down and look at exactly how that plays out. So you'll notice here we've got leafy greens, baby root vegetables, quick-growing crops. Some of the longer season crops that we'll have in here for our primary season, which is when it's warmer, would be carrots and beets. I'm not going to be planting carrots when it's cold. I'm only going to plant carrots and beets when it's warm. And this is important because my primary objective with this farm season we're going to look at is I want short days to maturity. I want 60 days to maturity, meaning that when that crop grows in the ground, whether it's transplanted or direct seeded, I want it to be mature and out of the ground in 60 days. So in order to do that with beets and carrots, that means I can't plant them on the shoulder season because the days are a lot shorter and a lot colder. And so if I plant carrots in April, for example, they might take 85 days to mature. Whereas if I plant carrots in the summer, they can be ready in 60 days if I can focus on varieties that grow faster. This is really important to understand because for us in the Northern Hemisphere and even Southern Hemisphere, we have exponentially shifting day lengths and temperature swings. When we're on the shoulder season, we've got a lot shorter days, we've got a lot cooler nights and cooler days. As we get to the summer, the days get exponentially longer as you approach the summer solstice, and it's hot, and we've got fast-growing, high-production scenarios, whereas it's different on the shoulders. This is important to understand, and that's going to be the basis of how I customize what we're growing on this farm plan. So these are the 5 primary characteristics that all the crops I'm going to grow have. In my book, this is called the CVR, the Crop Value Rating System. But in the book, I talk about how you can rate different crops based on 1 to 5 of these characteristics, and that will tell you if that crop is worth growing or not. In this case, because we're on a small land base, we're looking at a 1/4 acre, every crop I grow on this farm is going to meet all 5 of these characteristics. So they are shorter days to maturity, so 60 days or less. In order to make 80 grand on a 1/4 acre, we can't have anything that's 60 days or more. It's not going to work in the plan. And if it does, like the carrots and beets, for example, then I'm only going to grow them at the time that I can achieve those short days to maturity. The second thing is a high yield per linear foot. So how much in bed will that crop yield? And so that would be on the average of a couple cuts or a single yield that doesn't matter. I'm targeting a 1/2 pound per foot. So if a bed of arugula yields 12.5 pounds from 25 feet, that would achieve that. I would be getting 1/2 pound per linear foot. That's important to understand. The second thing is a high price per pound. So we're not growing onions, we're not growing potatoes, we're not growing winter squash, we're not growing corn. we're growing fast-growing, high-value crops. Generally, $4 a pound or more is the minimum benchmark that we would need to achieve to score the kind of numbers that we're looking at. The fourth thing is how many months of the year can that crop grow? If I can grow it for 4 months or more, then it'll work for this. If it's a really seasonal crop, like for example, a melon is a very seasonal crop. You can only have it, it's only harvested for about a 1 month period in the summer. You plant it in early spring, you set it in the ground in mid-spring, and it takes all spring and summer to mature, and then you harvest it in that last month. So a crop like that wouldn't make sense to grow in this context. So we're looking at things we can have almost the entire season. The one that would be not even quite making this characteristic in what we're looking at is tomatoes. But even the tomatoes I'm going to grow in this presentation are almost there. We're going to be picking tomatoes that are cherry and saladette tomatoes, fast-growing, many of them hybrids. We'll be picking from June, July, August, and September. So they actually can be in production for 4 months in this case. The fifth one, which is actually the most important characteristic here, is popularity. If the crop isn't popular and nobody wants it, none of the other these things really matter. Because you can have the most high-value microgreens, quickest growing, highest yield until you're blue in the face, but if nobody wants it, then it isn't worth anything. So that is really the underlying, encompassing characteristic that's really important to all of the crops that we're going to look at. So our season is going to start March 16th, and it's going to wrap up November 15th. That's what we're going to look at in this presentation. But if you're doing microgreens, you can easily push it year-round. So if that was your context, then you can do well over $80,000 on a quarter acre. In my book, I even talk about examples where you can be a food hub / urban farmer, source other stuff from other farmers, and there's many different ways to beef this number up if you're willing to experiment a little bit more in your marketing. So in the tunnels, we're going to grow cold-tolerant greens and microgreens in the shoulder season, and then tomatoes in the summer, and we'll interplant and cross those things over. So you'll see how that's all going to play out. Our primary market streams, in this case, are going to be restaurants. So this is going to deliver that 80% for us. The restaurants are going to be bringing us 80% of our revenues. In this model, we're not talking about CSA programs. We're talking about farmers markets a bit, but in a smaller context, but our primary target market here is restaurants. And that's not to say that what I'm going to show you wouldn't work with doing a CSA. It could. If you were to do it that way, you would have to be a broker. You would have to be a hub that's sourcing lower value products from other growers and selling higher value products yourself. So this could work in that context, but we're not going to look at that one today. We're going to look at something that I have a lot of personal experience with, and in a way I have done this farm plan myself in its own way. So restaurants are our target market, and the beauty about selling to restaurants is you can move a lot of product at once, right? I'm on my bike here, I'm delivering $1,500 of product. Takes me a half an hour to deliver, ride downtown. It's fast, it's a lot of leverage in a short period of time. Whereas if I go to a farmer's market, I got to stand there for 7 hours, and I got to individually package everything. So to do $1,500 of product, harvested, processed, washed, delivered, might take us 2 to 3 hours of labor on the farm. To do that same amount of product at a farmer's market or even in a CSA could take half the day, maybe even the whole day. So this is about concentrating efforts, like we said at the beginning. We're really leveraging our efforts and going with what's going to work and bring us the highest amount of value. So, restaurant orders, again, we're moving large volumes, case lots of tomatoes, case lot boxes of salad greens. We're going to look at that stuff, and I'll explain how that breaks down. But we're moving volume, right? We're not doing individual bags. We're moving volume at once. That's one restaurant order. That's a $600 restaurant order. 15-pound totes of greens, case lot bags of microgreens and arugula. We're moving volume here. This is the key to how this all works out. This is a smaller restaurant order, and we're going to look at some of what these orders look like. This might be an $80 order to a chef, to maybe a smaller niche market type restaurant. So we're going to look at a few different types of customers that I sell to. Packing restaurant orders. I'm showing these pictures to show you that we're moving volume here. We're moving boxes of stuff at once, and that's our 80% in this context. So we're selling at farmers markets too, that's important. Farmers markets, there's a lot of things about farmers markets. I could talk a whole day about farmers markets. But the beauty of the market is that it is a pivot point. When you're selling at a farmer's market, you are engaging with your community, you're getting to know people, you're building social equity. And that social equity will lead to other opportunities. So by selling at a farmer's market, I'm meeting more chefs. I'm meeting other types of people that will support my business. I'm meeting tradespeople that will want to trade. When I'm at a farmer's market, I have a carpenter, a plumber, electrician, a welder. I got all kinds of people that I know from being at the market that I'm trading with all the time. I'll take a paper invoice and say, I owe you $500 of vegetables. They'll come back and we'll trade our effort for effort, right? It's straight value for value. There's no tax, there's no inflation, there's no occupational licensing. It's straight up value for value. These are the things that I really get out of a farmer's market, and it's the reason I still do them today. Because yeah, if you ask me point blank, Curtis, if you wanted to make more money on your farm tomorrow without working more, what would you do? In an ideal world, I just wouldn't do a farmer's market. But I've done it so much now that I love all the other capital benefits that come out of the farmer's market, the social equity, the resources you get from it, the relationships, all those kind of things are really important. So even when we look at our numbers, you're going to see that the farmer's market, in the grand scheme of things, is quite small. But the fact that it has all those other lifestyle things in there is the main reason I do the farmer's market. The greenhouse is a critical component to how we're going to maximize the output. So essentially, half of this farm can be under poly at any given time. The third block was going to be under poly low tunnels, and the fourth block is going to be under tunnels like this. So they're all unheated greenhouses, but they extend our season enough that they increase our days to maturity on the shoulder season so that we get quicker days to maturity, quicker harvests, higher turnover for more of the season. That's really important to understand. And we're also going to be doing indoor microgreens. So, if you guys want to learn a lot more about indoor microgreens, go see Chris Thoreau, who's in the back there. Go see his workshop, and he'll show you what that's all about. They've got an incredibly profitable farm. What I'm going to show you with microgreens is how you can kind of tack these on to your farm and push your shoulder season, have more product in the earlier and later parts of the season. But it's by no means what is the gross possibility of doing this kind of stuff. You can get that from Chris. We're going to be looking at doing 30 or so flats a week of micros, maybe around $600 a week, a little bit less, a little bit more in some cases of the season. I can do them on the rafters of my greenhouse on the shoulder when it's winter and it's cold. So for March and even April, they'll be inside a unit like this, and all this stuff is in my book. And when it's a little bit warmer outside, but still not quite warm enough, they'll be out here. In the summertime, if I do microgreens in flats, they can literally be on my deck. They can be on the balcony of my house into July, August, September. They'll grow fine just outside. We might germinate them inside in flats, but they can sit outside and grow just as fast as they would inside, as long as it's warm. So something that's really key to this whole system working is that we're stacking and we're interplanting. We're maximizing the use of our space. There is never going to be a square inch of space on this farm that isn't in production. The only time that you're going to see anything on this farm where the greenhouses aren't pumping stuff out is in about a 4-week period when the tomatoes get about 3 or 4 feet tall, and then I've got the field crops, the quick-growing crops out because they're shaded out by the tomatoes, and then the tomatoes start fruiting, and then they're in production. So there's only about 4, maybe 5 weeks of time in the entire year where these greenhouses don't have crops in them. And that's because we're stacking time. We've got quick-growing, super quick-growing stuff on the vertical, and that works because on the shoulder season, the sun's lower in the sky, and then this isn't casting a shadow on the ground. We've got a medium-term crop, which is a lettuce, or it could be baby radishes, it could be any kind of baby salad green. The primary idea is that it's a quick-growing crop, and we get multiple cuts. So the greens are better in this context than, say, radishes. This Salanova lettuce, I'll cut it, it'll regenerate in 7 to 10 days, cut it again. I'll cut that stuff up to 4 times while these tomatoes are growing, and it won't interfere with the production of the tomatoes. Our tomatoes are planted very deep. They get planted almost 2 feet deep when they're transplanted. We only leave about 5 inches or so out of the soil, and they've got a ton of compost in each hole. There's no interference as far as soil fertility between the long-term heavy feeder, which is the tomato, and the shorter medium-term salad green, which is a light feeder. There's no interference at all. And even if you look at a soil map profile of our depth, we've got our shallow short-term crop, which really only needs about 5 inches of soil profile. It's occupying that space here. Our tomatoes are planted deep, and their profile is out of the way, so there's no interference at all. And they're a light feeder, so even then, we get maximum production out of our tomatoes, maximum production out of our ground, and the top, so that our greenhouses are pumping stuff out. In the summertime, they look like this, and they're still interplanted. Once they go into our hard pruning methods, where we're stripping every branch beneath the last ripened set of fruit, we've got basil on the bottom canopy, tomato foliage on the top, bare stem in the center. That creates many different opportunities. It allows for less competition with the tomatoes on the horizontal. It allows the sun to reach in to touch the tomatoes to ripen them quicker. By pruning them this way, it also forces the tomato into a survival mode because it thinks it's going to continuously die, and that's going to force it to ripen its fruit faster. This is manipulation of these living systems. But the very best thing about hard pruning, and again, there's a lot more about that in my book. We won't have time to get into it in detail today, but the very best thing about doing this is that by stripping off this foliage, as we approach the fall, the sun starts to come back lower into the sky. We then have created another opportunity to stack another timeline onto the end of the season. So now as our sun comes down, it's reaching the ground. I can now interplant again with my tomatoes, direct seed, quick growing, cold tolerant salad greens on the floor of the greenhouse. The light will reach there, and so now I can have a crop that's well established as I go into the fall. So by late September or about early October sometimes, we'll be going and just trimming off the tomatoes at the base. So we'll go in, after we've got all of our tunnels established with crops on the ground, and you're going to see how this all plays out on this timeline. As these tomatoes are in the ground, and at this point, into late September, early October, all the fruit is on the top. There's bare stem for almost 6 feet. All the light can get down. We've got crops that are well established going in there, and then we'll go in and just cut them off the bases. We don't have to interfere with the soil. We just shank them at the base. All those roots stay in the soil, and they'll decompose, and they'll be food for worms. That when we get into fall, every single one of our tunnels, again, is fully maxed out. All the beds are planted. At this point, we're going to be slowing down our production in the main field, and then we'll be ramping up our production again in the tunnels, just like we did in the spring. So our blocks, B3 and B4, which you'll see again, are going to be essentially in production almost the entire year. The greenhouses especially, the poly low tunnels a little bit less, but we're even going to have overwintered crops in those, and you'll see how I can plant stuff in October and then have it as early as March, even in the field. You'll see how all that plays out. So there's 14 crops we're going to look at today. That's what I'm using on this farm plan. And again, keep the context in mind. I'm not saying grow these crops and do this in this exact same way. This is just a reference point that you could use and slightly modify yourself. But these are the crops that I would focus on if I were to do it. If I was going to just go down to a 1/4 acre and farm that, and I wanted to make this kind of revenue, these are the crops I would grow based on the context that I'm in. The number one product on our farm here is salad mix. It's actually the number one product on my farm. It's the number one product on most market gardens. And the reason for that is there's a lot of optionality in a salad mix. What I mean by that is that it's a variety of different crops, and no matter which one you have more or less of each week, you can put it in the salad mix. The salad mix doesn't have to be the same mix every week. Most customers, if you're selling to high-end restaurants, they'll actually like the fact that your salad mix changes week from week. So our salad mix in the early part of the spring, and you'll see when we look at the month of April, My salad mix I'll call a braising mix. It won't have any lettuce in it. It'll just be mustard greens, tatsoi, baby spinach, red Russian kale, and maybe some arugula. There won't be any lettuce in it. But as we get into summer, the salad mix will be predominantly lettuce. The lettuce variety I'm growing that I've exclusively grown now is called Salanova. So it's a hybrid. It comes from Johnny's Selected Seeds. I'm not getting an affiliate for Johnny's. I wish I was. But I grow it because it's simply productive. Jean-Martin Fortier introduced me to Salanova a couple years ago. They started doing it on their farm. They plant it in heads. So we're not direct seeding our lettuce. We're planting it as a head, but it is insanely productive. On one bed of Salanova, so a 25-foot bed of Salanova, I'll get on average three or four cuts. In the summer, I might get down to 2, but on the shoulders, I'll get 3 or 4. One bed will generate $800. So that's one crop. Keep in mind, in most cases on this farm we're looking at, I'm going to have 3 other crops. So the Salanova gets transplanted. I use a mini soil blocker to do my Salanova, so I can fit 420 mini plugs in a standard 10 by 20 flat. So this is the only thing I use soil blocks for is this, and I do it just because I can get 2 beds worth or 50 feet worth of crop in one flat. That's why I started that way, and I plant it so often that I want to have less nursery space, real estate dedicated to this. It makes it easier. I get more flat. I use less soil. It's easier transplanting because with soil blocks, you just pull them out and plant them. It's not like a plug flat where you've got to poke it out. So there's less handling. So it might be a little bit more time to make that flat, but because we're transplanting it so often and consistently throughout the entire season, I prefer to do it in a soil block. It's just better for the context. So the lettuce is the primary crop in my salad mix, so the Salanova, and I plant it in a weed mat. So I've got a video for this on YouTube if you're curious about how I make these. I do it with a simple hand torch. It's very, very easy. I can reuse these tarps over and over in it for many years because they're not getting walked on, they're not getting the wear and tear that fabric would on, say, a perimeter or a walkway. We can use them for many years. And what it does is that it essentially eliminates weeding on these beds. So all I'm doing on my Salanova beds, which is my primary crop, which is the crop we're going to be doing the most of, the most often, and I get the most value from, I've eliminated weeding, right? So this is going back to that thing we looked at the beginning, is how do I double down and concentrate my efforts on the thing that is the most valuable to me? If I can eliminate weeding, that's a huge piece of the farm. Everything you're going to see today, we've also essentially eliminated weeding for everything else. On our farm, I'm a third of an acre. We did $100,000 in sales last year. We spent a total of 4 hours pulling weeds for the entire year. We did that through stale seed bedding, flame weeding, using tarps, using appropriate technology like weed mats or landscape fabric, and then putting it on the beds themselves. If it's a transplanted crop, it's weed matted. We're using this. The only time we can't use this on beds is when we're direct seeding, and that's for a lot of the crops we're going to grow. But in that context, we're flame weeding and doing stale seed bedding, and I'll show you exactly what that looks like. Also, the fact that we do very minimal tillage, we're only tilling the top ½ inch of soil, that's part of the elimination of weeding strategy as well. So you'll see how all that plays out as we get more into this, but we're going to go through this crop overview. So our salad mix consists of about 6 types of greens, and these 3 types I'm going to show you here I call auxiliary greens. So these greens are only grown for the salad mix. They're not grown for anything else. Their primary function is to add color, texture, and flavor to the salad mix. They're not grown for their yield, their price, or anything like that. They're just grown to add a little bit of texture and stuff to the salad mix. So I'll plant them in odds and ends areas. I'll plant them in half beds. I'll only plant small amounts of them. I might only have 5% of, say, a beet green in my salad mix, but just a leaf, in maybe in a 4-ounce bag, just having 1 or 2 of those in there adds color and texture, and it makes the product look nicer. So that's the point of all these. So beet greens, I only grow these in the summer. They're just direct seeded in the warmest parts of the year. Mustard greens are a cold weather crop. They do very well in the winter, spring, and fall. I can keep planting them in the summer, but I might only get 1 cut. But the neat thing about that time is that I'll direct seed this crop, and in 18 days I'll get the first cut. Literally. In July and August, I'll direct seed it. 18 days I'll harvest it. Don't get a huge harvest, but it's enough to add a bit of color to my salad mix and a nice spicy flavor and a nice texture. So it's about those auxiliary things than it is getting a high yield. Tatsoi is another one. It's a cold weather crop, does well in the spring and fall, does well in the winter as well. Can't grow it even late into the spring. Even into mid-May, I stopped planting tatsoi. It's too warm. I'm in a high desert in my climate. So as we get close to our summer solstice, we get up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So we can't grow stuff like this during that period. So it's one of the first things I plant in the greenhouse. You'll see that when we go through this farm plan. And it's one of the last things I plant, but I've stopped planting it by mid-May because it'll bolt. So the other three types of greens that we'll look at, and I'll kind of look at these a bit later, but red Russian kale, arugula, and spinach, those aren't auxiliary greens. Those greens go in the salad mix, but they're also grown on their own. So that's the optionality there. Is if I have a situation where I'm short on my salad mix, but I'm overproducing any three of these, then I can just throw those in the salad mix. That's what the optionality is all about. I'm flexible with the salad mix because I don't need to have the exact amount of each thing at each time of the year or each week. I'm flexible. I can improvise. I can roll with the punches. And that's what this whole situation is all about. Because I don't plan my farm the way most farmers do. I don't go and say, this bed in this block is going to be this crop and it's going to rotate to this. I basically say, this is going to be in high rotation area, and that's a select group of quick growing crops. What the allocation of those crops is, I don't really know until I start planting. I usually start with what I would have started with last year, but in mid-season, I'll modify my farm season or my farm plan. If one chef or a couple chefs is wanting more of product X, and I'm overproducing some other product, I'll pull that out of the ground and start planting more of something else. Because the beauty of the quick growing crop is that you've got a lot of, or a very quick time to see the benefit of it. In the summertime, most of the crops that I'm growing are mature in 21 days. So that's only a 3-week lag. So if I see coming down the line more demand, I can say, let's change this. Let's pull that kale out of the ground. Let's start planting more lettuce. Let's start planting more arugula, whatever it could be. We do that at a constant, like all the time, constantly. There's never anything on my farm that's overproducing that we're not selling. If that's the case, it comes out and something else goes in. So we're lean. We stay lean, we're small, we can roll with the punches and improvise. Because on this small of a land base, if you're not selling everything, you're losing money. Because you're spending the time to plant, manage, harvest, portion that product. If you don't sell that product, you had all those 4 stages that went into that, and you're losing money on that. So that is really key to what we're talking about today. So that was just salad mix. So that's my number 1 crop. My number 2 crop is going to be greenhouse tomatoes. So these are generally, they're hybrids, not all of them. Sun Gold, that's an open pollinated heirloom. We've got Sakura, Sweet Baby Girl. Ignore the heirlooms. We're not going to grow heirlooms in this context. Generally targeting a smaller tomato because they're ready faster. I can sell them at a higher price per pound, and they actually yield more when you look at per plant. Each of these plants in this farm plan will yield about 27 to 30 pounds of tomatoes. And that's because of the indeterminate hybrids. Indeterminate means that the tomatoes are going to keep fruiting up the plant. So a determinate, which is more of your staking variety, you plant in the ground, it sets its fruit in the summer, and it all kind of sets at once. The indeterminates keep going, and we do that through hard pruning. By forcing them upwards, we have a consistent yield, a weekly yield. That's really important to understand. And we're going to interplant them as well. Our irrigation for them is always on drip, so we'll have an overhead. We're not going to talk about irrigation today in this one, but there's a whole chapter on it in the book. These are irrigated overhead when they're interplanted, when they have quick-growing crops, and then we put in a temporary drip lines into the tomatoes. So those are some of the varieties I'm growing. In this context, the ones we're looking at mostly, all these are available in the U.S. and Canada. Sun Golds, Golden Raves, Mountain Magic, Sakura, Jeune Flamme. We're not growing San Marzanos in this one. I should have deleted that. So we're just growing the smaller ones. There's other ones out there too. You don't have to just look at what I'm doing and say, I'm gonna copy that. But the key to our hard pruning is we're pruning all the sucker branches, and then after our first sets of fruit, we strip every single branch off after that. For those reasons, we want to create light when we go into the shoulder seasons. We want to force the tomatoes to ripen quicker and push our production. That's the most important thing to know about tomatoes for this presentation. Our third most popular crop is microgreens. It might not be the highest revenue generator in this situation, but the beauty of the microgreen is that I can have it all year. I can have it in the winter, summer, spring, fall, doesn't matter. I can have it all year, and I can do it in a variety of different ways. In the book, I talk about ways to do it in the ground. I call it field microgreens using a board technique. Won't have time to get into that. On the shoulders, I will do it on the rafters of my greenhouse, and in the winter or the colder part of spring, I'm doing them indoors in a vertical shelving unit with artificial lighting. So the microgreens give me a lot of flexibility because they cover anywhere that I'm short. At the very beginning of the season, when we get into this more, you'll see how they're really the only thing that I have at the very beginning and a couple other overwintered crops. So the fourth thing is arugula, and there's a lot of optionality in arugula. There's multiple ways I can sell arugula. So I can sell a first cut. So I can, at 21 days, I'll go in and get a fast cut, which is a short crop, sell it at a high price per pound, $10 a pound, sometimes 12. On the third and fourth cuts, you'll get a bigger crop. It'll be more pungent. It'll be a little bit more, it won't be as tender as the baby stuff, so you can sell it at a lower price per pound, but it'll be a higher yield. So I can market it in two different ways. And the other optionality is that it can go in the salad mix when I'm short on lettuce or anything else, and it can be sold on its own. So there's a lot of flexibility. That's the key to understanding all the crops that we're going to grow here. Red Russian kale is the exact same thing. There's optionality. It can be marketed in different ways. You can have a bigger crop, a taller crop, or you can have a shorter premium baby crop. It can go in the salad mix. So there's three options with it in that context. It grows well all year. In the springtime, I'll get up to 8 cuts per bed. In the summer, I might only get 2, but it'll be ready in 21 days. So it changes. All of these things change throughout the season. Spinach, optionality there as well. As a baby crop, it's a premium crop. I can sell it at a high price per pound, sold on its own, or put in a salad mix. On the third, fourth, sometimes fifth cuts, you get a bigger crop, which is like what you see down below here, and that can be sold at a lower price per pound, but you get a higher yield, and you can market it to juicing cafes, restaurants that are going to use it for wilting or cooking. But on the first cuts, it's a premium baby crop. So the optionality is that I can have multiple beds of spinach going. I've got some baby ones coming online. I've got some others that I'm pushing more cuts out of, but that gives me flexibility on the farm because I've always got options. This is really key to everything we're going to do on this farm plan. Radishes are kind of an unsung hero of culinary, but also a crop for a farmer. The beauty of them in the culinary industry is that there's many different ways you can use them. You can dice them, you can slice them, you can shred them, you can split them, you can serve them whole, they can be baked, they can be braised. There's many different ways that they can be used in a kitchen, and the prime reason I grow as many radishes as I do on my farm now is because a lot of my core customers are chefs that I've gotten to know very well over the years, and I go into these kitchens, and sometimes I spend a half an hour in these kitchens, and they're showing me all the way they're using these things. And radishes are really important to our farm because they can be used by chefs so well. When we go through our season on this farm, you'll see that I barely sell any of them at the farmer's market. I mostly sell them in a case lot bag or in the boxes to chefs, and they'll sell a lot. I can sell 200 to 400 pounds of radishes kind of sold like this to restaurants a week. They're such a usable veg. They're available all year, except maybe our coldest months. But I can have them almost 10 months of the year. Turnips are the same thing. Turnips even have more optionality because a turnip can be prepped all the same ways that a radish can, but it can be marketed different ways based on its size. So once a radish gets big, it kind of gets pithy and woody, and it doesn't taste as good. It gets hollow. A turnip can. A turnip you can have a turnip the size of a Granny Smith apple, and it still tastes good. It doesn't get as hollow as a radish might. So it can stay on the field longer, and I've got options on how I can sell it. I can go in 21 days in the summer, go in, do a thin harvest, get a premium baby turnip, market that to restaurants at a premium price, and then I can let that bed sit for another week or two, and then go in and get a bigger crop and sell it in another way. And that might be better sold at a farmer's market. I can also even market the greens. The greens are palatable with turnips. Radishes, not so much. I mean, if we were in like a depression or something, we'd probably eat our radish greens, but we're not. But the turnip greens taste better. You can sell them to juice cafes. You can sell them to people that are going to use them for cooking. So even a turnip itself has three options on how you can sell it. You can sell the greens, you can sell a large turnip, and you can sell a smaller turnip. So there's a lot of options with how it can be used. This is really key to understand. Carrots, a little bit less optionality, but they're so popular. Everybody loves carrots. And the way I make them high value on my farm is I grow them short maturity, 60 days. So I'm only growing them in the summer, and I'm targeting a smaller carrot. I'm targeting a carrot about the width of my thumb. It has no core. When it's a small carrot, it has a higher sugar content. And this is important to chefs because high-end restaurants, and we won't have time to look at specific culinary today, but my workshop on Sunday we do. We'll go look at food plates. And the way most high-end culinary restaurants are using veg is they're using small to baby veg true to form, meaning that they'll have the whole thing on the plate. High-end restaurants don't just dice up the carrots or shred it up. They use things true to form. They look not too different than when they were pulled out of the soil, except you've got the dirt off, and maybe you leave about an inch or two of green. That's really the only difference. So I can make them high value by planting them at a higher density and getting a short date to maturity. So if I go 5 to 7 rows of bed, a 30-inch bed, and I harvest them in 60 days, I get a higher value crop, sell it at a higher price point, and it's out of the ground quicker. That's what's important. That's really what makes it more higher value to me, is if I can get it out of the ground in 60 days, it's higher value because then I can get something else into the ground right away. That's the key. And with this farm plan we're going to look at, there is no downtime for any of these beds. Anytime something's out, that bed's going to get replanted almost immediately, if not 2 days later. So beets are the same situation. I'm targeting a smaller crop, meaning that it's out of the ground quicker and I can get it turned over faster. It also has some of the optionality that the turnips does, is that I can pick it at different stages. I can go in, do a thin harvest, get some, and then go back the next week, let those other ones size up and pick them more. So I get a little bit more of a consistent pick than I do, say, a straight-up crop out like I might with radishes. In the summertime, radishes, 21 days, we go in, crop out the entire bed. Even if we can't sell all those radishes, we crop it out so that we can get another crop planted in the ground. And you're going to see how all that plays out. Kale, in this context, it's not a high-value crop, but I'm only growing it on the overwinter situation. So this kale will be planted in the ground the first week of August in the previous year. It sits over the winter. I can even actually harvest it and market it throughout the winter in unheated greenhouses, even sometimes in the snow. I've got a video for that on YouTube as well, showing it in the snow. But in greenhouses, it'll survive just fine in my climate. We only get to about 0 degrees Celsius, minus 10, which is, 20 to 40 Fahrenheit. So I'm only going to grow it on the shoulder season over winter, meaning it's one of the first crops I have to sell at the farmer's market at the beginning of the season, and I might have it again at the fall, but I won't have it for our primary season because I want high turnover crops for the rest of it. And there's 3 types of herbs we're going to look at. All of these herbs are only grown in small beds or they're interplanted. So we're not dedicating a lot of real estate to these crops. And the main reason is it's just hard to move big volumes of these crops. Like cilantro is actually a very high value crop when you consider in the spring and into the early summer, you can get 4 cuts from it and you can sell a 2-ounce bunch for $2. It's high value, but nobody is buying 20 pounds of cilantro. Unless you find maybe a salsa maker or something like that that can use that much, that's generally not how you're going to sell it. In my context, I'm selling it as a garnish to restaurants. In a $300 order, they might order a couple bunches of cilantro. So they're not really primarily going to be looked at. Just understand that they are part of this plan and just grown in small volumes. Oh, sorry, I was talking about parsley. Cilantro is the exact same thing. So everything I said about parsley is the same thing. Basil in this situation is only going to be interplanted with my tomatoes in my greenhouse. So I'm not dedicating any prime real estate to it whatsoever. The reason for that is I can't sell huge volumes in this context, because I'd have to have 1 or 2 or 3 beds of it to get volume, to say 10, 20 pounds of it a week. I'd have to have some prime real estate dedicated to it. It's not worth it for me in this context. It's better to just have it as a garnish, have it as an option for chefs, but it's just there, not occupying prime real estate. The prime real estate is going to go towards our high-value, quick-growing crops. So this is what our season is going to look like. Basically, what we have here is a typical bell curve. Most farm seasons look like this. They have a slow start, they peak out in summer, and then they taper back down into the fall. Our high season is going to be from May till mid-September. So that's the period where we're generally moving the most amount of stuff. And our peak season is in the summer. And this peaks out. It's important to understand what peak season means. It's the period of time where everything is growing as fast as it possibly can, and there's everything coming at once. The thing with the peak season that's important to understand is there's no optionality in the peak season. Once you're at peak season, there's nothing else you can do to increase production on your farm. There's nothing you can do. Everything's maxed out. You're selling as much as you can. There's nothing you can do. The optionality is on the shoulder. On the shoulder season, when you've got less production, things are growing slower, you can increase production by extending your season by using greenhouses, poly-low tunnels, growing crops that will do well on the short period of the season. That's important to understand because there's nothing we can do here. Once we're in peak season, we're in peak season. We're flying, and it's pretty much a repetition of each week after week. We're planting consistently, we're harvesting consistently. That's really all we're doing. The way to increase your farm is to focus on the shoulders. So this is going to be an average of our entire weekly sales for the entire season. We're targeting $80,000 on a quarter acre. We've got 35 weeks to do it. Our restaurant season will look like this. Restaurants in my area are generally fueled by tourists. Once people come into the town for the summer, we live in a lake town. Tourists come in, the balconies are filled up, people are on the terrace, everybody's eating salads, they want fresh, and the restaurants are cranking. They're going fast, and it's high turnover. So our peak season in this context is July until about the end of August. That's peak season for restaurants. And here's the one that seems kind of counterintuitive. This is how our farmers market season is going to play out here. Farmers markets for us are the busiest in the spring because there's very few farmers at the market. As an urban farm, we live in a city. We have a heat island effect. We have 35 to 45 more frost-free days than the average farmer. We can get a lot of stuff to market quick. And when there's less farmers at the market, there's less competition. So as we go through this play-by-play of our season, you'll see that I start stronger with the markets, so $800 to $1,000 to $1,200 a market, and then I actually taper down. Once I get into summertime, I'm doing a lot less at the markets, but I'm bringing less, and I'm just there to be there. There's even some times in the summer where I actually skip a couple weeks, and that could happen in here. You just adjust these numbers accordingly, because if there's so many farmers already there, there's sometimes it's like, what's the point of even going? I like to go because I don't want to lose customers, but sometimes it's just looking at the numbers. Last year, there was some periods where we were doing as low as $450 a week at the farmers market, so we said, let's just skip the next couple. But we were doing $4,500 a week to restaurants. So it's almost the opposite type of season. It starts really strong, peak season's in the beginning, and it tapers down, and then it actually comes back a little bit up, approaching Thanksgiving, kind of getting to the end. People start coming back to the market, most of the tourists are gone. And that's kind of what makes our market less busy in the summer is there's so many tourists walking around, they're not actually buying stuff, that the locals find that annoying. Because they want to just get in and get out, and then there's all these bodies just occupying space, and so it means that they'll kind of go early, get their stuff, and get out of there, but a lot of them will avoid it altogether. They might be in a CSA or something at that point. So that's kind of how our season is going to shape. So I think right now what I'll do is I'll take a few questions. Anybody have any questions so far?
Yeah, with the Salameva lettuce.
Yep.
Do you ever use the Johnny 6-row seeder as well for salad mix, or do you just do Salanova?
Well, I don't use the 6-row. I used to. I sold it. I use the Jang seeder now. Okay. And I don't direct seed Salanova. It's all done as plugs. And yeah, I guess that answers your question. Yeah, I don't use the 6-row. I use the Jang seeder. We'll look at an image of it coming up. Yeah.
Declining farmer market sales, is that also, could that have something to do with less people showing up because it gets hotter and hotter? Or have you noticed that there's the exact same amount of people at farmers market?
Do you mean customers or vendors? Yes. It has to do with that it's hot. A lot of the locals don't like that, so it gets overwhelmed with tourists, and the crowdedness, and also the fact that there's just so many farmers. We have at our farm, we have the most popular farmers market in British Columbia. We get 6,000 people a day when we're in high season at our market. We have about 20 certified organic growers, and we have probably 50 other growers. Like, it's insane, our farmers market in the summer. So it's kind of just, I just kind of go the path of least resistance. I don't want to fight that, so I'm just kind of like, I'll just push more volume to restaurants, bring a little bit less stuff to the market just to be there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. It's weather, it's crowdedness, and it's competition.
Is it on concrete or black?
It's on concrete. That's why it kind of sucks too, because it's just really hot and uncomfortable. So I don't bring as many greens to the market in the summer as I do in the spring and the fall.
What happens if your farmers market weeks are only like 17 to 20 weeks?
Well, I mean, in this context, that would work fine. It just means that you have to push the shoulders and sell more to restaurants and other markets outside of that period. Because in this model we're going to look at, the farmers market is pretty negligible. It's not. Yeah, early in the season markets, push those hard and then taper down. Like, when does your market go? And then what does it finish, in August or something? Yeah. So in a way, in this context, that'd work just fine. Because in the summer, you know, you've got other stuff pushing that to restaurants. Yeah.
How hot is it getting in your greenhouses?
Well, we open them up, so it'll be at summer, if it's 100 Fahrenheit outside, at the high point of the day, it might be 110 in the greenhouses. But I'm not going in the greenhouses when it's hot. When it's summertime, we work siesta shifts. We'll start 5:30, 6 a.m., and we're done by 12 or 1. And then we shut her down. If I have to go back to work as the owner-operator, I might go back after dinner for an hour just to get a couple things done, but we don't work at the high point of the day. And anytime we're harvesting the greenhouses in the summer, it's at 6 a.m.
Are you venting with electrical?
No, and I would if I had long tunnels, but because in my urban context, my tunnels are 50 feet max. So I've got the sides rolled up, I've got the doors wide open, that's enough ventilation in that case. But if they were 100-foot tunnels, I would have to.
Are you keeping your soil fertility continuously high?
Yes. When you see as I'm turning over beds, I am. I'm consistently putting in organic matter. I start each season with 2 inches of compost on each bed, and I do no-till, so that stays in the top, the top profile of the soil. I'm not affecting the deep soil or the subsoil at all, except if I'm broad forking it. Soil fertility is very high. And in my high rotation crops, they're low feeders too, and that's important to understand. These crops barely draw anything from the soil, but I'm still putting organic matter in as I go. Yeah, John?
When are you taking that first cut of Salanova, at what stage? Are you letting it get to the full head size, or are you doing more like a...
Yeah, I let it get full head. And this is the beauty of the Salanova, is there's so much optionality with it, because it's a hybrid, the leaves don't get bigger. They kind of get to a point, and then they don't get any bigger. It just grows more leaves. So that's a beautiful thing, because when you direct seed lettuce, if you look out in your field and you say, I got to cut that now, otherwise it's going to be too big and it won't be as marketable, you have to cut it. Whereas the Salanova, you can just leave it in the ground. You'll come back next week, you'll just get more yield. And that's great, because lettuce is our primary crop. If you don't have that, you're always battling. And sometimes what will happen in a season, if you're targeting a high-value baby green and you're selling to high-end restaurants, or not even high-end restaurants, just restaurants that want a consistent salad, if one week you show up with a nice lettuce this size and the next week you show up with a lettuce this size, they're not going to like that. So that's the beauty of the Salanova, is it gives you that optionality, because you can just let it go, cut it, you just get more yield. Yes, Scott?
What else have you put in your 6-foot beds of herbs? Like what else are things in there?
Yeah, it's just the cilantro, parsley. It might be things like mustard. It might be field microgreens, but we're not going to look at that in this. It's just odds and ends things. It might be scallions, like spring onions. You know, maybe 6 or a 12-foot bed. I never really dedicate a full bed to those kind of things because I just want those things to offer a bit of variety. They're not there to be the meat and potatoes of the season.
2 quick questions. One, your tomatoes, do you prune them to a single stem leader? Or do you do 2 liters?
Yeah, single stem. Tomatoes are pruned to a single stem leader.
How much do your greenhouses cost to build?
They're cheap. I mean, those Caterpillar tunnels, the short ones, were $500 for a 12 by 50, and that's just using Johnny's the Caterpillar tunnels. I made them cheaper by making my ridge poles out of 2x4s and using less steel. They had a lot of fancy clamps and stuff like that. I just kept it really simple. Those bigger tunnels I have that are 18 feet by 50 feet, those are a little bit more because they were a kit, but I bought them used. So those I might have paid $700 a piece. Yeah.
How do you deal with the shade profiles in the lots that you use in the urban areas?
Like if the sun is setting behind a house or something like that? Yeah, that's a good question. On the one-day workshop, we'll get into that in more detail, but basically I look at each plot as a microclimate and what will that do at each time of the year. So the better you get at farming, the more you'll start to look at, you'll start to just recognize where the sun is at each time of the year and each time of the day. So before I take on a plot, I suss that out. A lot of my plots, like I'll always take something with the south aspect. I'll never really take a farm that is blocked to the south unless it's a deciduous tree that, you know, will shed its foliage on the shoulders. But I'm looking at the east and west buildings, and in most cases, if you're in the northern hemisphere and your aspect is down here for the most part of the season, that will be fine. If you're getting shade at the high point of the day at 3 or 4 o'clock, if you've got a big building on the west, that's not so bad because that might actually give your crops a break from the hottest point of the day in the summer. But in the spring and the fall, it's all down there anyways. You're going to get a high per capita ratio of sunlight anyways. The east is the one that's generally you got to be a bit more careful of. If you've got too much eastern shade, your soil will warm up a lot slower. So, but then I just customize my crops for that. I just grow exclusively more cool weather crops at a plot like that. Whereas if I had one that had a bit of eastern or western shade in the later part of the afternoon, that could almost work for anything. Because most crops, if you can get 8 hours of solid daylight exposure, for most crops, that's enough. Maybe not so much for tomatoes, but pretty much everything we're going to look at here, it will be enough. Any more?
Chris, have you run into any like regulatory barriers or anything getting your products to customers and producing food in these residential environments that are specifically zoned residential?
I've come into regulatory stuff as far, zoning. I've had to make text amendments. But to be honest, everything I do is against bylaw. The key is knowing your neighbors and having strong social equity built up in your community. That's the key. I've gotten 5 awards from my city. I've had the mayor give me 2 of them. My greenhouses, like even though they made a text amendment to allow greenhouses on vacant lots, they made the size requirements too small. Like they made it 200 square feet. With 200 square feet, what am I going to do with that? So all of my lots have larger greenhouses than are allowed by city council, but nobody cares because nobody complains. I know all of my neighbors. I continuously bribe them with vegetables. I've built a lot of good community and social equity in my areas that people love what I do. That's the key. So I'm not telling you to go and break the law, but if you know your neighbors and you know your community and they like what you do and they support what you do, then it's a whole situation of it's better to ask forgiveness and ask permission.
Have you ever run into soil pollution, like lead or other kinds of soil pollution?
I haven't. I don't work with contaminated soils, so if I start a new site and if the soil's contaminated, I won't use it. So even if I suspect there's soil contamination, I won't even test it and use it. It's just I go to the next thing. So is that what you mean through contamination? Or do you mean like air pollution somehow getting into the soil? Okay, cool.
And I might have missed this a little bit earlier, but in this model right here, are we talking about different sites, like meaning you've sussed out a site on a house?
Yep. Well, it doesn't matter. You can have multiple sites. Like I showed at the beginning, like how it could hypothetically be laid out. 3 different plots, total of 100 standard beds, however those are configured. It doesn't really matter. Yeah.
How are you approaching your markets? Are you just picking a restaurant, walking in and saying, hey, I got stuff? Or?
It's all about market research. I mean, that's one thing I get into heavily on the one day, and it's in the book too. But it's really, you can do a lot of online research. Just search field to fork restaurants in your city or farm to table. Figure out who's doing it. Then go and walk by those restaurants on a Monday, Wednesday, and a Friday and Saturday. See how busy they are. There's a lot of nuances. Like on the one day, I talk for an hour about restaurants, and there's quite a bit on in the book. But it's really just about doing a lot of preliminary research before you go in there and talk to them, so that you can show up, deliver a lot of value in a short period of time, not waste their time, make an offer. I mean, for me, when I go and meet a new chef, he doesn't need to know anything about me, what I do with this kind of stuff, even what I do with pedal powered and urban. All I say to a chef is, we're a small farm, we go small veg. We specialize in culinary, small vegetables for restaurants. I keep it simple. I might bring a fresh sheet and a few sample products, leave it at that, follow up in the next week with an email, follow up with a phone call, go in again if I don't hear from them. You have to stay on chefs because they're busy people, and if you're in a Napa Valley type area like I am in, there's a ton of competition, and it's cutthroat. There's farmers coming in every single day with baskets of tomatoes trying to get chefs' attention. So one thing I write about in the book is using fresh sheets consistently, every week coming out with fresh sheets, and when you're building new relationships, you've got to go in and bug them. And they'll tell you that. But you first got to know a lot about that restaurant. You got to know, are they busy? Because you want to sell to busy restaurants, right? If and you can figure this stuff out just by going in there. That's why I said go in on a Monday, Wednesday, a Friday, and a Saturday and see what it looks like. Because if you go in on Monday and it's dead, you go in on Wednesday, it's dead, you go in on Friday, it's kind of busy, and you go in on Saturday, it's busy, that means that they're going to be a fluctuating restaurant, and restaurants are dicey businesses. 85% failure rate in the first year. Most don't even make it past 3 years. So doing a lot of preliminary research is going to really make it easier for you. There's a lot more. I could talk about it for an hour, but I'll just have to leave it at that for now. Okay, one more question, and then we'll keep going. Fresh sheet, it's in the book. You can download I've got a free sample. I've got a free package of stuff that comes with my book, points to my website. It's a thing you send out every week that I make it smartphone friendly. List of my products, the prices, the amounts. It's just an update that I send to my chefs every week. Okay, so let's carry on. So we got 4 blocks on this farm. We're going to start with the greenhouses. These are the first things that I'm going to be preparing and seeding in the early spring. And some of the first crops I'm going to plant in there are arugula, tatsoi spinach, baby kale, and mustard. So that's my red Russian kale. These things grow quick. They germinate fast. I can cut them multiple times, and they do well in cool soil. This is really important to understand. These white blocks, you'll notice, that says stale seed bed. So what's happening right now on the farm is I'm preparing large beds at once. I'm going out with my tilther, and I'll show you an image of this right here, and I'm preparing large areas of beds. So we do a no-till or low-till on our farm. We don't rototill anymore. We come in, we put 2 inches of compost on each bed. Then we broad fork or pitchfork each one. The primary objective here is just to get to the subsoil, open up a little bit of oxygen so we can have our nitrogen and oxygen cycles in the soil. Open that up, put on some compost. You can do this with a rake, but I use a little tool called a tilther. It's from Johnny's Seeds. It's a tiller. It's electric powered, but it only tills the very top profile of the soil. It's essentially just mixing in my organic amendments into the soil. Then I go in, flatten it out with the rake. Those beds are prepped. So what's happening here at the beginning is I'm doing that on big areas of beds, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to water them in, and I'm going to cover them with a tarp immediately. So essentially what I've done here is I've loaded my rifle. I've gone in and I've planted all these beds. They're prepped, they're covered, so weed seeds can't blow in, and I'm also going to encourage any weeds that are in that top layer of soil to germinate the tarp will either smother them out as they pop up from the soil, or I can go in and flame weed them before I plant. But the basic idea is that those beds are locked and loaded. So as I get into my more steady planting, all I'm doing is pulling off the tarp and planting. And there's going to be very little to no weed pressure in them whatsoever. So I'm prepping up large areas of beds. I'm direct seeding in the greenhouse. And at this point, I'm even going to start, well, into later March, this is just an overview of March, I'm going to actually start harvesting overwintered crops that I'd planted in the late summer and early fall the previous year. That's going to be my first to market strategy. Microgreens and some overwintered crops. So like I said, we're prepping beds, we're tarping beds. Nowhere at any given time in my farm is there exposed soil. If something isn't planted, it's covered. I never have a bed prepped that's just sitting there because weed pressure is blowing in. You might have your neighbor's cat come in and dig up your bed and screw with it. So everything is covered all the time. And that is going to preserve the soil. The bugs like it. The worms love it. It's going to encourage weeds on the top to germinate, which will either smother out or torch with our heavy artillery. And it's just going to keep the soil condition better because you're always going to have external factors that can mess with your soil. Once our beds are prepped, they're covered until they're planted. It just makes everything easier on the farm. So the flame weeding is very crucial to this whole situation. We can't do this kind of farming without a flame weeder. You can get this tool in the U.S. There's one company that have been selling them, but they've been selling a lot of them because people like Jean Martin and I are out telling everybody to flame weed. But it is absolutely paramount because I don't want to spend time pulling weeds on my farm. That is a task that does not have a measurable return. There's 3 things that I do on my farm that are absolutely paramount to being as effective as we are on a short land base in a relatively short season. We focus on the tasks that pay. Those are planting and everything to do with planting, whether it's prepping beds, harvesting and everything to do with harvesting, whether it's pulling stuff off the field or portioning it, and it's marketing. So that's delivering, making bags of greens, whatever it is. Those 3 things have a measurable return. Because I can go out in the field and I can plant and I can measure my expected outcome. To say if I go and plant 4 beds of radishes, I can expect to have 400 bunches of radishes. I can go out in the field and harvest. I can harvest those 4 beds of radishes and say, hey, I got 380 bunches. That is a measurable outcome in a period of time. And marketing is the same thing. I can go and stand at a farmer's market and sell $1,000 of product. That is a measurable outcome. Moving irrigation lines, moving polytunnels, pulling weeds, those things do not have a measurable outcome. So everything I do is to eliminate or greatly mitigate those tasks and focus on the tasks that pay, the 3 things that I just mentioned. This is absolutely paramount to what we do on the farm. And appropriate technology, such as using tarps and flame weeders, is exactly how we do that. Because weeding is a thing that most organic farmers do. Most people who are, say, a large-scale organic farm, farming with tractors, they'll tell you that they'll spend 30 to 50% of their time pulling weeds because that's what they have to do. You can't just spray Roundup, right? If you're organic, you're not just going to spray Roundup or a herbicide. You got to go and physically manage those weeds. You're either doing that with tractor cultivation or you're doing that with hand cultivation. Most farms are doing it with tractor cultivation, and then they have to go in and hand cultivate the areas close to their crops. So if we can eliminate weeding, we can reduce our labor allocation by at least 30%. That's key to this. Okay, projector. Okay, there we go. I got it from, it's called 123 Flame Weeders. It's out of the US. I think it's out of Ohio. So mostly what we're doing is direct seeding our crops. So all of the quick growing crops we're doing, except in the case of the Salanova lettuce, which is transplanted, everything else is direct seeded. I use a Jang seeder. You don't have to use the Jang seeder, you can use whatever you like, but I like the Jang because I can literally run with it. And the bed doesn't have to be perfect. The 6-row seeder and the 4-point seeder, you got to have a very perfect bed, which means you got to spend a little bit more time to get a perfect bed. And when you move it, you got to be a little bit more careful. This Jang seeder, I can literally haul ass up and down the beds. And that's how I work on my farm. I run. If I can run, I'll run. It's fun, but I want to get things done quicker so I can go to the beach and I can have a social life, right? So when I'm planting, I'm cranking. I'll be planting 9 rows in a 30-inch bed of salad greens. I am literally stepping like this and moving fast and up and down. The Jang seeder is very accurate. So this means I don't have to spend that extra time to make my beds absolutely perfect, which you need to do for the 4-point and 6-point. That's why I like the cedar. It also works in the rain because it has a cover on it. And it doesn't pick up mud, so I can direct seed in beds that are wet, which is really key. Some of the other cedars won't work that way. Like the 6-row and the 4-point, if your beds aren't perfect and the soil's a bit mucky, you can't even seed. Same as the earthway cedar, it picks up dirt. The Jang has solved all those problems. That's why I use the Jang cedar. And again, I'm not getting an affiliate from Jang either. I promote it because it works. It's a good tool. So now we're getting into our season. So now we're on the 3rd week of March here. And so we're continuing to plant. So all those white areas, those were locked and loaded, right? I did the tarps. We flame weeded them. They were stale seed bedded. Now we're going to continue planting these blocks. So here's a little legend up top, just so as you go through. It's kind of cut off a bit. But yellow means that it's just being planted. Green means that it's growing. And dark green means that it's going to be harvested. And you'll see that play out as we go through. The white means that it's empty and the beds are prepped. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to plant another block of a variety of different greens. The exact amount doesn't matter so much, but it's going to be some of those cool weather greens. And so this is all in the greenhouse. Arugula, tatsoi, spinach, baby kale, mustard. So I'm getting into succession. I planted that first area with the same types of crops. About 2 weeks later, I planted the same again. So I'm going into succession at this point. The key to the shoulder season is that we're going to be planting in large amounts in wider intervals. And as we get into the summer, as you'll see in this, we're going to go to shorter amounts in shorter intervals. Because on the shoulder season, the day lengths they're not varying so much day to day. So the problem with that is that as we approach the spring equinox, the days are actually going to start ramping up. You get from the winter solstice to the spring equinox, the days are going to kind of go like this. So if you plant, say, on the 1st week of March, and then you plant again on the 3rd week of March, those crops will both be ready at the same time. Whereas in the summer or late spring, if you plant 1 week and then the next week, you'll have consistent, predictable outcomes. Whereas on the shoulder season, you can't. So it's generally better to plant in wider intervals in larger areas of crop. Because I can do this now. I can plant, say, 2 beds of arugula. Just say, for example, I'll plant 2 beds of arugula in there, and that will be 2 weeks worth of arugula. I can cut 1 week of one bed, and then 1 week the next bed. And they'll be generally the same size. Whereas if I did that in the summer, that wouldn't work. If I planted 2 beds of arugula in the summer, and I cut 1 week, the next week the other one would be way too big. And I would have a lot of inconsistency in my product and my yield, and just the customers won't like it. But in the springtime, we can get away with wider intervals and larger groups of plantings. And so that's what you'll see as we go through this part here. So at this point, we're starting to, so this is our greenhouse. These are our greenhouses, I should say. So these are all under poly like this. And then these are our high rotation poly low tunnels. So these are our low tunnels to the ground. These are called Johnny's Quick tunnels, I believe, or maybe they call them low tunnels. They're movable. And you'll see as we go through the next weeks that I'm going to move these from block to block. That's what's really cool about the low tunnel, is it's got a lot of optionality. I can use it to plant, I can plant out an area, cover them in tunnels, let that crop get established, and then take them off and put them on another crop to get them established. Because the shortest, the period of time where there's going to be the most variation in the days to maturity of a crop are in the very beginning stages, probably about 30%. It's that germination period. If the soil's too cold and you're prolonging your germination, you're going to prolong the entire crop pretty exponentially. But if you can germinate that crop and get a couple true leaves on there, maybe even 2 sets of true leaves, you can take it off and it'll grow a lot faster than it would otherwise. So we can move these tunnels around, and you'll see how that plays out. So in this 3rd week of March, I'm starting to plant areas in the field. These are covered in poly low tunnels. So we're doing radishes, we're doing salad turnips, spinach, baby kale, arugula, and I'm putting on here what my expected harvest day is, and you'll see how that plays out. All this information is based on me taking spreadsheets and tracking all my days to maturity at each time of the year for each crop. So I have an expected outcome. And in my workshop that I talk about spreadsheets, you'll see why that's so important. So as we go through the month here, sorry, my computer is kind of lagging for a second. There we go. Third week of March, I'm starting to offer microgreens that are grown indoors, and I'm starting to sell to restaurants. I might be doing about $500 or so to restaurants. Sorry, I got a computer lag here. I think it's because I'm recording this, which I probably shouldn't have done. Okay, I might have to stop this because it's causing me, oh, maybe not. Okay, let's see. Oh, geez. Go back, sorry guys. So this is kind of how our sales are going to break down at that period. I'm selling to a food hub, so they're just sort of a CSA type thing that's sourced from other growers. So I'm selling to them, I'm just selling them microgreens, and these are actually based on customers that I have. I sell to them year round. I sell less to them in the summer, but all I do is really sell them microgreens and some of my really early crops. I'm selling to a green grocer, so it's like a type of a retail outlet, a small Whole Foods type place. I'm selling to a juice bar, entire flats of microgreens, and I'm selling to a restaurant where they're just buying microgreens. So it's small orders. But this is what early shoulder season sales look like. About $500 a week at this period. So not a lot of stuff, but we're starting to get into production. So as we get into the fourth week, we're finishing planting out our greenhouse. This is the last planting I'm going to do in here, and I'm going to put in some Salanova transplants, and we're going to harvest those by about the third week of April until the second week of May. At this time, I've got an overwintered area in one of our other blocks. I planted carrots in that block in the first week of August, and I have a video for this on YouTube if you want to see. I was harvesting carrots in 2 feet of snow. It's possible. It's all about planting them before it gets cold so that they mature before the cold comes. So in my context, I plant the first week of August. They're mature by about the second week of October. They get covered with the tunnel. They don't get watered anymore. I'll even go and cut the greens off them, and they're essentially just stored in the soil for the winter. And if you keep that soil dry, when you have fluctuating temperatures, like when you go below freezing and above freezing, the soil won't thaw and de-thaw, or freeze and thaw. It doesn't have that stress. So your carrots will actually survive. So I'm going to be cropping out carrots in this month. So I'm showing up to a farmer's market with carrots, overwintered kale, spinach, and a bunch of microgreens. I've got a lot of product at the very beginning of the season when there's other farmers that barely have anything. That's key to how we're going to be getting cash flow at the beginning. So we are going to be planting we're harvesting here again. So we've got harvests of carrots here. We've also got harvests of the same idea in a way. Overwintered spinach, overwintered kale. And we've got crops growing, and now we've only got a little bit of space left to plant here. But we're going to keep going through and planting as we go. So this is what some things I'm selling to in the fourth week of March might look like. I'm not at the farmer's market yet. I'm selling to the food hubs, the greengrocer, the juice bar. I'm selling mostly microgreens, but I've got some carrots. I'm moving boxes of carrots to restaurants or at this juice bar. And I'm selling some overwintered spinach case lot bags to other restaurants. And so now, we're still doing about $500 in sales, and we're growing from there. So now the farm is starting to pick up. We get into mid-March, things are starting to happen. I'm going to start planting in tighter successions coming up. So now I'm planting out the entire rest of my poly low tunnel beds, more baby greens. We're harvesting now consistently each week our overwintered crops that were planted in the fall the previous year. We're planting more salad turnips. We're putting in a second succession of Salanova. Now, as we get, so the fifth week of March is the 30th of March. It's also the first week of April. This is going into my primary farmers marketing period. So my markets go from April until the end of October. It's pretty common in a lot of places. Our sales are going up now. Now I'm selling about $1,000 a week of product. For a small farm at that early in the season, this is really good to have that much cash flow this early in the season. So our available products are, like I said before, I've got overwintered kale. So that kale was planted in August the previous year. I've got overwintered carrots. Those were planted the first week of August the previous year. I've got overwintered spinach. That was planted in the first week of October the previous year. And they're all covered and basically just sit dormant for the winter. And then I've got pea shoots, sunflower shoots, and radish shoots. So I've got 3 types of microgreens. So I'm coming to farmer's market, the first market, with a lot of product. I have more product than most large growers. Because of this, I don't have a ton of variety, but I've got enough stuff that people at this time are pretty stoked to see fresh product. And the restaurants are really excited about it too. They're stoked to get carrots and even the fresh field stuff, because they'll get microgreens all year, but they can have some of these overwintered greens in the early part of the spring. So this is what a week in sales at that time of the year would look like. So I'm starting with a pretty strong farmer's market sales, $800 first week of the market. I've got a good variety of crops, right? I've got my microgreens, I've got my overwintered crops, I've got 2 different ways of packaging spinach. I do a large bag and a smaller bag. And I've got lots of microgreens that I'm selling to restaurants. But this isn't even close to what it would look like in the summer. So as we get into the first week of April, the next week, so now we're starting to get into our other field blocks. We're starting to plant more. And again, we're going to be going at this point into tighter successions in smaller areas as we get into the main season. Keep in mind that a lot of blocks just look like this. Those beds have been prepped, they've been fertilized, they're ready to go, they've been covered with a tarp. So I'll go into another block like this. So in this case, I'm just going to go back here and see what we're planting. Okay, no, we're not planting this week. So we're still not planting every single week. So we've got blocks like this. But as I go in and I'm going to plant a block of that, I might just pull half of that tarp off and leave the other part covered. If I didn't smother out the weeds entirely from the tarp, I'm going to go in with the flame weeder and flame those crops. So that's how I'm essentially not going to have to worry about weeds. Once they're flamed and I go in and I start planting, these crops are going to come up totally clean. I don't have to spend any time weeding them. So now we're going to get into more intensive planting. And what's happening now is I'm going to move tunnels from one place to another. So this area that I would have had planted as spinach and mustard greens and arugula and cool weather crops, I might have had those tunnels on there for 2.5 weeks or so to get that crop relatively established. And then I can take those tunnels off and put them somewhere else to expedite the germination of that crop. That's the beauty of the low tunnel, is it gives me optionality. And I can also use it to manipulate the situation. So say I've got a crop that I've planted and it's under a tunnel, and I'm going, okay, that crop, I want that for the next 2 weeks. It's growing too fast. That's another reason I might take that tunnel off, is I can slow it down. Or I might look at another crop and say, oh, geez, I need to get that crop here quicker. I'll put a tunnel onto that one. So say, there's a bit of labor in this sense. And again, this isn't tasks that pay, but it does in a sense, if I can expedite the production. I might look at another crop and say, you know what, let's expedite that. Let's pull a tunnel off here and put it over here. Because it's all about just manipulating the space to get the most amount of the land. And that's what we're doing in this context. We're uncovering stuff here, putting it over here, direct seeding more quick-growing crops, putting in radishes, salad turnips, things like this. We've still got a lot of open bed space, and all that's tarped, all those beds are prepped. It's just like a loaded rifle ready to go. So at this period too, we're starting to harvest from the greenhouse. So our greenhouses are now coming online, and at this point, the farm is starting to produce a lot of product. So we're going to interplant those later, and you'll see what that looks like. Here's a little image of it here, where I'm still harvesting stuff from the greenhouse with my greens harvester, and I'm going to have tomatoes in there. And the tomatoes are actually going to go in shortly. They're going to get interplanted. So the way we put our tomatoes in, it doesn't even, for the most part, interfere with what's already in the ground. And that's how I can keep consistent production coming out while those tomatoes are growing, because they don't need the space at that size. They're going to keep pumping out. So as we get into the second week of April, now we're starting to do more volume. We're starting to get more greens. Our output's coming higher. Our overall market sales are going up. We're starting to get a bit more production. And into the next weeks, we're going to get a lot more production. We're going to sort of approach this exponential curve of growth in a way. So greenhouses are entirely planted and they're entirely in production. The blocks that are under poly low tunnels, they're starting to come online now. So we've got our overwintered stuff that was planted, that's in production. All of this is growing. So in the next couple weeks, that's all going to be starting to fly. But what's happening at this time as well is we're starting to put our tomatoes in the greenhouse. So the greenhouses are in production. We've got more production coming online in the field, and now we're interplanting our tomatoes into the greenhouse. So depending on the configurations of my tunnel, I'll do it in a couple different ways. I might just plant the tomatoes in the walkways, but over on the right side of the walkway. So my beds are 30 inches. I've got a 10-inch walkway, which is nimble, I know. But for the crops that I'm growing, it fits within the context, because my quick-growing crops, they don't actually take a lot of vertical space. If you have some crops that are tall and they drape over, you'll lose your walkways really quickly. But because I'm doing baby crops and they're in and out of the ground really quickly, I can get away with a 10-inch walkway. Like Jean-Martin Fortier has an 18-inch walkway. That doesn't work in my context because I need more space to grow, but I'm not growing a lot of the crops he does. If you've got a tall crop like a broccoli or a cabbage, cauliflower, even kohlrabi, it needs a lot of space. But for these short, quick-growing crops, they don't. I can get away with a short walkway. That way, when I'm interplanting my tomatoes, I can just put them in the walkway over to the side. So they'll actually literally be an inch away from the greens that I'm going to cut. And in some contexts, or sometimes, if I don't have the walkway, depending on how my greenhouse is configured, I'll take a stirrup hoe and go into a 30-inch bed of greens, say it's an arugula or a red Russian kale or a spinach. I'll take a stirrup hoe and go in and I'll scratch out 1 or 2 rows of that bed. So I'll compromise a couple rows of that crop and then plant my tomatoes in there. That's what you're seeing here. We've scuffed out 2 rows of that arugula so that we could fit our tomatoes into that particular spot. And it was really all depending on where we had our cables on the greenhouse to have our strings hanging down. So there's no exact methodology to that except on what the configurations of your greenhouse is. That's the important thing to understand. So as we're doing this, we're planting them deep. So this was a bed of radishes. That was cropped out, and then tomatoes went in its place. I will interplant basil along there as well. But you can see that the tunnels are still in production. They're still pumping out a lot of product when we have the tomatoes in there. Okay, so now we're getting into the first week of May. Now there's starting to be a lot more consistent action on the farm. We're far enough past the spring solstice or spring equinox and close enough to the summer solstice now that days to maturity are a lot more predictable. So when you look on your seed package or look in Johnny's Selected Seeds catalog and it says radishes, DTM 28, that means 28 days to maturity. Those are the average days to maturity of any particular crop. That information is really only relevant in the main season, and that's what's happening now. We're getting into the main season. I can start to get into a position where I'm planting every single week. So I'll be starting to plant groups of crops like 1 or 2 beds of radishes, 1 or 2 beds of arugula, every single week consistently from here until about mid-August. And so that's what you're going to see. You're going to see shorter intervals, tighter with smaller amounts, whereas on the shoulder we were larger amounts in wider intervals. Now we're going to go into tighter intervals. So now the farm is really producing. We're pumping stuff off the fields where we had the poly low tunnels, and even at this point I'm starting to take some of those tunnels off because I might say, okay, this one's coming along too quickly, let's take that tunnel off. Let's slow it down so that I can look at my beds in succession and say, at any given time I walk out into my field and I'll say, okay, these 2 beds of spinach, that's this week. Those 2 beds of spinach, that's the next week. Those ones are the next week. And then on the 4th week, I'll be reharvesting the first. I'm always looking at my field and thinking long term. What's coming down the line? What do I use on average per week? That's really key to understand. So we're cropping out here. We're cropping out lettuce. We're cropping out spinach. The farm is really starting to produce. We're going to be moving into about $1,600 a week in sales at this point. We've still got a little bit of space left, but once we get into mid-May, we're at a point where there are no more beds on the farm that haven't been already planted once. That's where you hit sort of a standstill. At that point, If you don't have enough coming off the field that you can turn under, then you have nowhere to plant. And the key to this model succeeding is that we have to have consistent place to plant crops. So you have to understand what's coming off and what you can replant. So you can see our sales are growing. We're bringing more to the farmer's market. We're almost getting to a point here where we're going to peak out at the farmer's market. We might hit around $1,000 to $1,200 at the market. I've got salad mix now because we're harvesting our Salanova lettuce. I've got different types of mixes. I've got a braising mix, which is just a non-lettuce salad mix. I'm bringing more to restaurants. I'm starting to get bigger orders at restaurants. We're doing entire boxes of greens. We're moving more. We're moving more volume at this point. We're starting to sell in larger volumes. And there's some cool things that are happening at this point too. The greenhouses are starting to transition. So we've got areas that the beds are they're finishing. Whatever we finish, we're going to leave. We're going to cover with weed barrier or landscape fabric, and there's going to be a period of time where these greenhouses aren't producing as much. It's not at it yet. We've still got some field production happening in here, but all the greenhouses are now planted with tomatoes, and we're just harvesting the last bits of all of these beds. So we're getting the third and fourth cuts of certain types of greens. We're cropping out, we got some baby bok choy here. We're cropping things out, and then we're going to leave them, and then the tomatoes are going to take over at that point. So into our second week of May, we're starting to really pump out production, and now I'm planting every week. I've got stuff going in consistently, and we've got the greenhouses are essentially, they're done. They're cropped out to make room for tomatoes. So what I'm doing now is I'm actually widening out the beds effectively. So if you look at this last image, you can see I've got 6 30-inch beds in there, but I'm only going to have 4 rows of tomatoes. So that's effectively what's happening here, is we're widening them out, and we're just freeing up room for the tomatoes to take over, and this is what that looks like. As those crops come out of the ground, I'm just passively, I'm not disturbing the soil, I'm not turning them under, I'm not doing anything. I'm just passively rolling out landscape fabric, tacking it down, and smothering those crops out. At this point, the tomatoes are entirely on drip. The overhead in the greenhouse is no longer being used. So there's a period at this point of about 4 weeks where that's all that's going to be in there. Tomatoes are growing. We're pruning them maybe once or twice a week, and they're flowering, but there's no fruit. So they're not in production yet, but they will be shortly. So it's the only time in my entire growing season, in even a 12-month year, that there isn't production out of the greenhouses. It's when these tomatoes are growing. Because otherwise, I would have had field crops in them, quick-growing, cool-weather crops, and then this is the primary crop that occupies the most amount of time of any particular crop in the greenhouse, but it's got that period of growth. And so as we get into the third week of May, now look at how it's short, it's small plantings in short intervals. 2 beds of this, 2 beds of that. And I've got another couple weeks until I'm fully planted out, but everything else on the farm is growing, and it's going to start getting to be turned over. But we've got a lot of production coming off the field. So this is a few weeks later. So the tomatoes are starting to get more vertical volume. They're starting to take up more space. And so at this point, I couldn't even have field crops in here if I wanted. They would be too competitive, and they wouldn't get enough light. Because this is probably, this is the third week of May. So the sun is still somewhat low in the sky, so there's going to be shadows cast along this way. So these areas are effectively just walkways now with the weed barrier. And that's what I want. I don't want to spend any time weeding stuff in here. That's just a waste of time. So I might as well passively take care of it and let the weed fabric, which is my appropriate technology, do the work for me. 4th week of May, everything is planted out. At this point in time, if I don't have stuff coming off the field to replant, I'm screwed. And I've done that before. And it's a mistake that many farmers make, is they just get too trigger happy right off the bat. They plant too much stuff, and then they hit a wall where they go, I've got to decide what to pull out of the ground, even if you might have had to harvest it. And I did that in my first year. I started planting in tight intervals too early in the season, and then I just had way too much ready at once. Because if you plant in tight intervals on the shoulder, you might plant the first week of April and the second week of April. I kind of said this before, but I just want to say it again so that you understand, is that those crops will be ready at the same time, most likely. So you want to space things out wider when you've got your sun further in the sky, and then you plant things tighter as the sun comes higher in the sky, because you've got longer day lengths, warmer days. Things grow quicker. In the summertime, there's an actual difference between 3 days of growth. If I plant a radish on Monday and I plant another radish on Thursday, they'll actually be mature a week apart. In the springtime, you wouldn't even notice. In the early spring, you can plant things 10 days apart, and they'll probably be mature at the same time. So it's really important to understand that we're now tightening up our intervals, and we're planting more consistently of our same weekly needed crops. Also, what's happening at this point is I'm putting in beets and carrots. So this is the first planting of beets and carrots for the season. And so again, this is appropriate for my climate where I'm at, but I haven't planted beets or carrots at all at this point. And it's because of the days to maturity. I have done it in the past, and even on my farm now, I'll do it, but they'll go under a poly low tunnel, but it means that they'll probably be ready in 75 days. I want 60 days to maturity for this plan to work. In order to make 80,000 on a quarter acre, I need to have short days to maturity. The crops are out of the ground and they're replanted immediately. So here we've hit the wall, right? We've got nowhere else to plant. So now I have to make sure that all these dark green ones are going to be harvested for their last time and then turned over and replanted immediately. So usually, in a best case scenario for us, we're harvesting on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and we're portioning and packing on Fridays. That's the best case scenario. The weather doesn't often work out that way. My primary objective on my farm is to optimally harvest at the best weather. So if I look at my 7-day forecast on a Monday, and I see that it's going to be raining on Wednesday and Thursday, I'll go and do my harvesting on Monday and Tuesday and do my planting in the rain. Because I'd rather do that than harvest vegetables in the rain, meaning that I have to wash them and sort them more, and it could add 10 hours to my week. So that was kind of a sideline, but it's important to understand that all of this would not work if you didn't have a walk-in cooler. I'm assuming that you all have my book, and you do, and that I say in that book, if you don't have a walk-in cooler, running a farm this way is extremely difficult, because it means that you have to harvest the day that you deliver or the day before you deliver. Like with Chris Thoreau and his microgreen operation, they can get away without a walk-in cooler because they're not hindered by weather. You can harvest microgreens inside at any time. For me, if I can save harvesting in the rain or unideal conditions, it can save me up to 10 hours of washing and sorting vegetables. Primarily washing greens. If I can avoid washing greens, it is a huge time saver on my farm. So I'll do everything I can to avoid that. But so my week is being structured around that way, but I will change anything in here to make sure that I don't have to deal with the weather. So if that means changing my weekly flow, so be it. It doesn't matter. It'll save us a lot of time. And I'm going to show this one, and then we'll take some questions. But as we get into now we're in the first week of June. So now you can see these. Now we're actually cycling back. We're starting to replant the areas that were already planted. By June, every single bed has already been planted once, and now we're onto our second succession of all these beds. But now what's going to happen is now the days are getting exponentially longer. I'm 20 days from the summer solstice here, and at this point, in my climate, I've got 18 and a half hours of daylight, and I'm starting to get into 80 to, I'd say 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's warm, things are growing fast. At this point, the cycling is going to happen faster than it ever did. At this point, things that I plant now, so I'm putting in arugula, spinach, baby kale. This will be the last time I plant spinach for the season until the fall, because it's too warm. At this point, these crops will be probably out of the ground very quickly, like 21 days, 30 days, and then it can be replanted again. So now our cycling is going to get a lot more exponential. So at this point of the season, I'm basically going to go into a routine. I'm going to be, whatever it is, I'm 2 beds of arugula every week, 2 beds of radishes, 2 beds of turnips. At this point, everything is very predictable, And so we don't need to go through what that all looks like. It's very simple in that way. I've got my main season crops in the ground. My tomatoes are set. They're starting to produce. We're getting the first pickings of our very first cherry tomatoes. Carrots should be mature by about July. So the farm is in production, and we're essentially, at this point, just going on a repeat because I've got steady days to maturity, relatively predictable weather outcomes. I don't have to fluctuate a lot of things. It's just, what do I need each week, and what am I going to, and how is that going to look on the field? So at this point of the season, we're doing about $2,500 in sales. This isn't exactly my farm. This is a quarter acre. My farm, we're probably doing a lot more than this. But we've got restaurant sales. We're starting to move volume. So now we're moving boxes of salad mix to restaurants, 10-pound boxes of salad mix. We're moving boxes of arugula. We're moving big volume. We're starting to get the first picks of cherry tomatoes. Those are going to our primary restaurant customers. I'm not even taking those to farmers markets yet. They're going just to my favorite restaurants that spend a lot of money on our farm. I kind of play favorites. The ones that spend the most amount of money, that are the nicest to deal with, they always get first dibs on things. So that's what's happening at this point. We're getting into very steady production, and this is essentially what the rest of my season into the fall is going to look like. We're going to skip ahead to the fall. We'll take questions before that, but we're going to skip ahead to the fall and just essentially skip June through September because this is all it is. That's it. Once I'm into a predictable season, I've got regular intervals of crops like radishes, turnips, arugula. I've got 2-week intervals of baby kale, mustard greens. I've got 3-week intervals of Salanova lettuce, carrots, and beets, and beet greens. That's it. Once we get into the summer, our farming season is actually very easy because it's the same thing week in, week out. I might make modifications based on things that I see in the marketplace. If I say, we're producing too much arugula, but we need more lettuce. Okay, let's reduce our weekly arugula plantings and put in more lettuce, or whatever it could be. Because at this point of the season, I've only got a 3-week lag. Most of these crops, from the time they go on the ground, are mature in 21 days. So if I direct seed radishes, 21 days to harvest. If I transplant a Salanova, which has been growing for 3 weeks in the nursery, and I put that in the ground, it's about 3 weeks to harvest. Everything is I can quickly change because things grow so quickly. That's really key to it. So just a reminder of where we are and where we started. So now we're approaching peak season as we get into June. Once we get into this area, we are cranking out every single week. All we're doing is planting, harvesting, and marketing. That's all we're doing. We're not doing anything else on the farm. We're not even moving around poly low tunnels. All the poly low tunnels are off on the farm. The greenhouses are pumping. It's just weekly plantings. If the weather goes well, once we're into peak season and high season and approaching peak season, my week is very, very static. Mondays, I'm prepping beds, turning over beds. Tuesdays, I'm planting in the field and I'm planting microgreens. Wednesdays, we're harvesting and washing. Thursdays, we're harvesting and doing a bit of portioning. Fridays, we're portioning and delivering. And then on Saturdays, we're at the farmer's market. Sundays, we have off. That's it. That's all we do all summer. The only thing that's anomalous there is weather. If I look at the 7-day forecast and see that I'm going to get a curveball on Wednesday and Thursday, I'll do as much harvesting I can on Monday and Tuesday. And then I'll do the planting in the rain, if I can. And so I would way rather do the planting in the rain than harvest in the rain because it can save me so much time. If we don't have to wash our greens, it saves us 10 hours because I don't have to spin them, I don't have to sort them. In a best case scenario, all of our restaurants, they want greens unwashed. So that might not be the case for everybody. But with our Salanova lettuce, it's got a weed mat on it. Even if it rains, it doesn't kick up dirt. They're never dirty. So it's better for our restaurant clients to have an unwashed green because they have to wash it anyways. So it's handled one less time. They get a way fresher product that looks better on the plate. So we're going to avoid washing greens at all costs if we can and avoid harvesting things in the rain. It just makes it easier. When you're working in the rain, your boots are getting muddy. It's slowing you down. It's uncomfortable. It takes longer to harvest the greens because the rain kind of knocks them down a bit. So I'll restructure my week at any given time. But the point is, once I'm into my main season, we're pretty much predictably doing the same thing day in and day out. There's nothing else besides planting, harvesting, and marketing. So those are our restaurant sales, so we're all on target for that. And these are our farmers markets. So now, at this point in the season, into mid-season, we're very slow at the market. We're selling small amounts of stuff. We're just there to maintain a presence. And there's often times in the summer that I'll actually skip a couple markets and go on a camping trip for the weekend. I like to do that if I can, and that's really part of the quality of life thing, but I'm just focusing on what's important. So, do you guys have any questions so far?
For perspective, can you give us your first and last frost dates and your peak highs and lows?
Yeah, my first frost date isn't really till about the end of October, and my last frost date, according to the Farmer's Almanac, is about mid-May, but it's really well before that. Because I'm in a city and I have that heat island effect, my last frost date is really the second week of April, even the first week of April. Yeah, and my high points, once I'm into, like July and August, we're anywhere between 90 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit a day, and it might get down to 70 at night. It's hot and dry. We're in a high desert.
And what about winter lows?
Winter lows, we'll get down to, I always forget the negatives. Celsius, we're at 0, maybe -10, so I think that's around 10 to 20 Fahrenheit. Yeah.
So related to that, have you looked at the days of maturity based on agricultural heating days?
Agriculture which days, sorry?
Heating days. So it's a formula that's based on the temperature of the day and a reference temperature that if your temperature reaches above that, then it's counted as a certain number of degrees of growing days.
No, to be honest, I don't get that scientific. That sounds like good information, though. Maybe I should look at that. What I do is and this is when I'll do my workshop on spreadsheets, I just track all my DTMs for every time of the year for each crop, and that way that's my framework. So I know what to expect from there, just based on my own bioregion.
So related to that then, if you're moving location or consulting with someone else, would you mostly go by the solar length of the day to adjust your planting schedule, or would you go by the temperature?
It depends on the crop. For these quick crops, probably the solar. But for things like tomatoes, it's heat units that's probably a bit more important. So, but I mean, if I'm consulting in that situation, there's a lot of local knowledge that I'll often ask that client to source out, and then we'll use that as a framework. So it might be information like you just mentioned that I would get them to source out so that I could be more effective. I have 2 walk-in coolers that are 4 by 6 and 6 feet tall. And that's enough for a farm like this. It's even enough for a third of an acre. Anything more than that, you probably need an 8 by 8 by 8. You probably need, or a third sort of style restaurant cooler.
So harvest, clean the beds, are you still seeing again, are you just going to plant?
At this point, yeah, so great question, John. I've got a slide just to answer your question there. I got a bit of a lag, so I'll show it in a second, but yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to what you're doing for labor during this time?
So my farm is 2 people working on average 30 hours a week. So we might work a little bit less on the shoulder. Maybe I might work 60 hours a week on the setup phase, which is kind of late March into mid-April, but then I'll be down to 30 hours a week in the primary season. This farm plan would require 2 people, the same thing. This could be done with 2 people. It could, if you really were ambitious, it could be done on your own. I've set my farm up to be that way. I have one primary worker who works the same hours as me. If a worst case scenario were to happen and he were to get sick or quit, I could run my farm by myself. That's the way I've set up this small farm. And if I did that, I would work 60 hours a week. My farm can be run on 60 hours a week total. Yeah.
So you have the species that you plant weekly, bi-weekly, for 3 weeks, and a weekly plan of harvesting and days you plant, days you harvest, days you clean. What about, my question is, strictly in terms of germination. So you put your seeds down, what happens if you get a really hot day and your seeds germinate and they dry in the sun? So how do you...
That's a great question. That's a really good question because it's an important question. Thank you for asking that. It's important in the summer. especially when you're direct seeding these kind of cool weather crops. Because what you noticed, what you should have noticed or would have noticed in that list of crops I showed you is that most of them are spring weather type crops. They do really well in the spring, and some of them will have shorter harvest periods in the summer because it stresses them. You might even get lower germination rates. So a strategy I use is when I'm direct seeding, I'll explain this in a second, when I'm direct seeding, and this is the height of summer, I would hand water in a bed right away. I'd plant it, hand water it heavily. One thing I'm starting to do is actually use a shade cloth. When I was down in New Zealand, I hung out with this guy, Jody Roebuck, who does biointensive farming, and it's hot where he is in New Zealand, and he has a 70% shade cloth he has cut out as bed units. And it's brilliant. So he preps his bed, plants it, hand waters it in heavily, and then covers it with a 70% shade cloth for about 4 days to a week. That crop germinates, then he takes the cloth off. That's a good strategy for really hot and dry climates, and I'm actually going to be doing that this year. But the way I've done it before is I just hand water it in, and as well as my irrigation running in the summertime every night, I might even go in midday and hand water a couple of those beds just to get that germination. For the most part, I buy them all at once. And then there might be the odd anomalous event where I started to plant more of something that I didn't think I would, that I might do another order quickly from Johnny's or something like that mid-season. For the most part, I get all my seed at once.
Are you going to cover costs in this presentation?
No, that's in my workshop, my one-day workshop. I break all that down.
Is your 30-hour work week include administration, or do you outsource?
That includes my administration. I spend about 6 hours a week in admin, so that's talking to chefs, inputting information in my one day presentation, and even on the spreadsheets presentation on Saturday, I'll talk about that in more detail. But yeah, it's putting information into my spreadsheets, putting accounting information, managing accounts, who owes me money, who doesn't. I'll spend about 6 hours a week on that.
If your time schedule during the day, you say you're using siesta hours, going early in the morning or half the day, would you be able to, would it affect the production scale or process if you were to flip those to the afternoon hours? Like 5 till much later? I mean, would that affect anything?
No, not really. I mean, if that was the context for you and that made more sense, do that. Okay. Yeah, totally. I mean, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for optimal conditions for everything. I'm looking for optimal conditions to work in. So in the summertime, I'd rather not be working in the punishing heat. So then I'm flipping to siesta hours. I work early, we shut it down by 1 at the latest, and then I might go back in the evening if I have to. And there are some times in the summer where I'll wait to harvest greens until the evening because I want dry and I want cool. If I can harvest greens in those temperatures, that's perfect. Whereas in the summer, I might get dew in the morning, and I go and harvest greens, they're wet. Now that means I got to dry them. So if I can avoid that, it saves me a ton of time. So I'll flip my schedule around however it needs to be to create optimal conditions for myself.
So this model here is a full-time model. Do you have or know of other models that are maybe a part-time?
Yep.
People that are working?
It's all in the book. Yeah, I've got a few different case study examples that I've consulted for people with that outline that, like how you could transition, start as a part-time farmer in your own front and backyard, transition to full-time, totally. Yeah, that's all in there.
This might be along the same lines, but is there kind of as you're getting more land, is there kind of a tipping point between adding selection and volume that you can produce to like approach restaurants and stuff like that?
Yeah, so you're doing a small amount when you're a transition or a part-time farm. What's the tipping point until you start approaching restaurants to move volume?
Yeah.
Yeah, like when you start producing, it's hard to give you a number because it all depends on your context. It all depends on what restaurants you have available. If I were to do it all again, if I were to say start tomorrow and I say I started with a farm like this, I would just sell the restaurants. I would just go right in and do restaurants because you don't have to stand at a farmer's market. You could take the weekends off. You could just do 2 restaurant deliveries a week. I think if you're targeting, if you were just going to do $25,000 a season or a year, you could do that with just farmers markets if that's what you wanted. But you could also switch and do that same amount to restaurants. But I would say if you were doing $25,000 to farmers markets, if you started there, If you were going to go to about 40,000, then you'd really want to start talking to chefs, because then you'd want to start moving volumes of stuff. You want to be moving 10-pound cases of boxes of mixes. You'd want to be selling case lot bags or boxes of radishes. You'd want to start moving volume, because that way you just leverage your efforts better, because then you can do entire beds. You can crop out an entire bed and move that all in one or two places, as opposed to just packing more stuff to the farmer's market.
Like with the chefs, do you go in and be like, hey, I got one or two good crops, or do they want like a selection to get from like?
Never try to be a one-stop shop. No, very few farmers are going to be a one-stop shop. Just accept that, because there's going to be times you're short, and then they're going to go to somebody else. So if you just give up the whole idea of being a one-stop shop right off the bat, you'll make your life a lot easier, except that they're going to get stuff from other growers. Yeah, essentially what you said. Like when new restaurants approach me, I offer them one or two products, because like greens are the things that I can scale really easily, and they're the things that I produce in the most. So any new restaurant that comes to me, I just say, all I can sell you is greens. That's all I can promise you right now. If you, over time, if you're consistent and whatnot, and we develop a relationship, and they pay me on time, which I won't say to them, but you know, if they're a good customer, then I'll start offering them other products. But anybody new right off the bat, I'm just going to sell you greens. So like I take on new customers every year, and that's all they do. But if they stick with me and they pay on time and they're a good customer, I'll start offering them other stuff, and I'll start sending them my fresh sheet. Otherwise, I'll just say, this is all I can do, because I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. I want to underpromise and overdeliver. That's like the ethos of us on the farm.
I'm sure you're going to cover this in a future class, but from the time you're dropping off your product, what's your terms on invoice?
It depends. That's a big subject. If you're at the workshop, I talk about that extensively. It's also in the book, but basically, just to answer your question, if you're a restaurant that has a good reputation, you've been open for many years, you can go on terms right away. You can go on 21, 30-day terms, whatever. If you're a small restaurant that's new, you're COD right off the bat. If you're a restaurant I've never dealt with, you're generally COD. If you're small orders, you're COD. If your orders are $100, anywhere between $100 to $200, you're going to just be COD every time, because they can usually pull that out of the till. If you're a big restaurant, you can go on terms, but only if you have a good reputation. Because I've been royally screwed by restaurants before. I got screwed out of 10 grand this last season. 3 restaurants that tanked on me, went bankrupt. So you know, I don't want you guys to make that mistake. I want you guys to learn from it. But the thing is just COD if you're new, or if they've got a long-standing chef and the restaurant's been open for 10 years or something, and they've got a good track record, they're always busy, I'll trust and put them on terms right away. But you really got to be careful, because restaurants are notorious for not paying their bills.
On that, have you found any kind of restaurant would have like an allergic reaction to saying COD, or do they really care? Term COD, does it faze them, or do you find that some do get phased when you say COD?
Yeah, some do. You know, it's an interesting question, David, because it's not like there's no real point-blank answer, because it's all what the context is. Like, what's the relationship with that restaurant? What kind of reputation does that restaurant have? I'm at a point now where I've got such a good amount of I've got 7 restaurants that pretty much buy for me and give me 80% of my business. 7 restaurants. And anyone new, because restaurants are so come and go, I'm at the point now, somebody comes on and they're deterred by COD, to me, like, that's your problem. Like, if you can't handle that, then I'm sorry. Because
Essential hallmark that they're perturbed by, so you just walk away.
Totally. I mean, but that's where I'm at now. I mean, when you're starting out, you do need to make those compromises a little bit more. You know, you're going to want to work with people. You're going to want to build up those relationships. So, but if the orders are small, like, I would say, just from my own experience, telling you guys what's happened to me in previous years, like getting screwed over by restaurants, happened a couple times. Last year was like epic screw over. That I would just say, save yourself the trouble and just go COD. Especially if they're a new restaurant and they want big orders, that's dicey. If you got a chef who's just new into town, they open up this restaurant, it's real fly-by-night, and they want $500 orders and they don't want to pay COD, it's risky. It's risky. You can roll the dice. If you roll the dice, I would say do it this way. Say you got to pay the last invoice when I show up for the next one, because then they can only screw you once. So if they rip you off there, okay, yes, it was a loss, but you had minimal exposure. Maybe try it that way. But be very careful with chefs, because it's not necessarily the chef that's the one that screws you over, it's the management. And that's why generally if you're going to sell to restaurants, you want to start with the owner-operator types. You want to start with the people that it's like one chef and she might have 2 other kitchen staff and 2 other servers. And they might have 20 tables tops. That's your ideal customer, because they'll pay COD, because they don't have accounts receivable, or they don't have an accounts payable. They're managing everything themselves. They would actually prefer COD. I have some customers that have bought from me for 6 years, COD every single week, and they're totally happy that way. But that's the owner-operator types. Once you get into the luxury hotels, the resorts, the wineries, big kitchen staff, 70 people in a kitchen, 30 servers. Like, those are big restaurants. Those are high numbers. They have accounts receivable and accounts payable. They just can't do COD. They won't have that kind of volume for cash in their registers, so they're going to have to go on terms. So, but with those ones, you're only going to want to do those if they've got a reputation. Really what I do is I just talk to other farmers. So there's a real nosy way you can do it. This is kind of what I do, actually. When I deliver to a restaurant, and they'll have an inbox. So like you'll give them an invoice. They'll sign one that you keep for your record. So that's record that you delivered, and then you'll take the other one and put it in their inbox. I sometimes just kind of look in the inbox and see what other growers are selling to them, and I often will call those growers up and make friends with them, because I don't see them as competition. I see them as friends. And we're all trying to, the best way for me to operate within that space, because I'm in a highly competitive space, is to go the path of least resistance, and I won't compete with people if I don't have to. So I'll kind of talk to other growers and say, like, hey, what are you bringing these guys? Okay, then I'm going to focus on something else. And try to find ways that I can work with them where we're not competing, and that builds a good relationship with them. And if you can have that nice foundation of restaurants that you know, they'll share information with you. And that's key, because like, how is so-and-so paying their bills? Well, they've owed me for 6 weeks, they're behind. That stuff's good to know, and you can't really get that any other way than just asking. So you kind of got to suss that information out yourself. So let's just go through the rest of this, and we'll just leave the rest of the time for questions. So as Jonathan was asking about what's it like mid-season, how we're prepping, this is what we're doing. So this is my no-till or low-till prep in the summer. At this point, so we're in high rotation. Like, we are planting and harvesting every single week. We have no other beds to plant except what's already been planted. So what will often happen is my ideal harvest days are Wednesday and Thursday. So if weather's all good, harvest Wednesday and Thursday, portioning and packing on Friday. Monday and Tuesday are prep and planting days. So I might have harvested this is a bed of arugula. I might have harvested that bed on Thursday and then left it until Monday, and then on Monday I come in and I turn it over. But there are some times where I'll actually harvest on a Monday, because not only is weather important to me when I'm harvesting, but the crop optimal harvest is what's good for me too. If I look at a crop of arugula and I say, oh, that's perfect size right now, that will be beautiful in a salad mix, it'll be beautiful sold on its own, I'll harvest it on a Monday. So there's 2 scenarios. I could have harvested this on Thursday. I could have harvested this on a Monday. Let's just pretend this is Monday. And I wanted to wait. I looked at it on Thursday and said, let's save that one for Monday. I come in here, harvest it on Monday, get a perfect, beautiful cut. Say it was a second or third cut. Now, one of us will take that crop home to the walk-in cooler. So it goes in the cooler right away. And this is hot at this time of year. This is like 100 degrees. Now I'll turn that bed over immediately. So I take a scuffle hoe or a stirrup hoe, just a simple hoe with a blade on both ends. I go in and I'm shanking off the crop. So I'm not pulling it from the ground. I'm keeping the root matter intact in the soil. This is very important for high fertility soil microbiology. It's because I want to shank it off the soil, keep the root matter in the ground. That will decompose and be food for worms very quickly, because it'll turn anaerobic and then it'll be eaten by the worms. So I shank it off. So I'm just taking my scuffle hoe and just shanking out the crop. It takes about a half an hour to do this. This is a 50-foot bed. This takes about a half an hour to do this full process. So I shank it off, rake out that stuff. That goes in the compost pile. Then I come in and I refertilize the bed. So at this point, I'm not using compost. That's just because it's not in my context. If I was on one big farm and I had one central location, I could use compost every time on my farm. It'd be easier, and I'd prefer it. But I am multiple locations, so I prefer a compact fertilizer between my rotations. So I start with 2 inches of compost on all beds at the beginning, and then in mid-season, I'm just using it's actually a composted turkey manure. You could use blood meal, and there's all kinds of compact organic fertilizers you can use, but I'm just using it's a composted turkey manure. I can use about half a bucket for one bed. Keep in mind that arugula is a very low feeder, barely draws anything from the soil, so that's enough. That's enough to actually give me more fertility than I need. That goes on, I take my tilther, and I mix that into the top half inch of the soil, level it out with a landscape rake, plant it immediately. So that happened in a half an hour, one bed. And that's what it's looking like at every week of the season, the entire season, is consistent harvesting, consistent planting. So we have to make sure we have enough coming off so that we can replant it again. But that's how we're managing soil at that time of the year. So as we get into the fall, so now what's happening at this time of year is similar to what happened at the very beginning. I'm now going to switch from short intervals in tighter successions, smaller amounts in tighter successions. I'm now going to retreat back to wider intervals in larger amounts. So I'm now going to be planting larger groups of beds in wider intervals. So my weekly schedule of planting and turning over is finished at this point. So now we're prepping crops for the fall. We've put some overwintered crops in here. So we did this in the first week of August. I planted a bunch of beds out to be overwintered, because in order for me to have carrots in the winter or early spring next year, I need to plant them the first week of August. So this is just the whole month of September, an overview. So I'm planting areas of beds, areas of radishes, areas of turnips, entire areas of lettuce, because when those get mature, they might be ready by early October. If I've got 4 beds of radishes that are mature in early October, that's totally cool. That's totally fine. I can pick one bed one week, and I can pick the next bed the next week, and there won't be much difference between the crop size. Whereas in the summer, forget about it. If you're going to plant 4 beds of radishes in the summer, they need to all come out at once. Because one week it'll be nice, the next week the other ones will be way too big, because the days are too long and the temperatures are too hot. But in the fall, it doesn't matter as much. So I'm going to go to wider intervals, and that's what's happening here. So we're just doing larger groups of stuff. And now we're starting to interplant back into the greenhouse, just like we did in the springtime, but in the opposite way. So now we've freed up from our hard pruning a lot of these tomatoes, and these actually ones we killed. We just cut off at the base. But now we're interplanting into our greenhouses our fall crops that will be mature as we get even into early October. As everything else in the field starts to slow down, we're going back into production into the greenhouses, and then those will stay in production even into November as everything else starts to peter out. So that's what they're going to look like. We've still got tomato production happening, but we've got establishing crops in there so that by the time by mid-October, these tomatoes are out. We're just shanking them at the base. Because we've also stripped off a lot of foliage up until this point, getting them out of there is easy. If you have a tomato plant that has tons of foliage, it's a mess to deal with. And you've got debris falling all over the place. It's a mess. So here it's a lot easier because we just go in with a pair of scissors or a pruning shears, shank them off at the base, bundle them up, take them out. So it's actually a very easy cleanup. But I mean, we have to be nimble, right? We've only got 10-inch walkways. We have to be nimble in there. But by the time I get into October, those greenhouses are so packed full of crop that as everything else peters out in the field, I'm now on full production again in my greenhouses, just like I was in the spring. So as we're going into October, we're just leaving beds, right? So I don't do green manuring on my farm. I don't have the time. My crop is the green manure. So if it was a salad green that was cut multiple times, it's been cut 3 or 4 times, and I just leave it in the ground. And so I'm not going to touch that bed. I'm not going to turn it over. You know, a lot of old school farmers, they go and rototill their entire field going into the winter, which is absolutely counterintuitive if you know anything about soil microbiology. You rototill the soil, and then the winter rains come, and you wash away all your soil. It's completely insane. So if I have beds, I'll just skip ahead to a slide here to show you. If I have beds that have been cropped and cut, they'll either just lay there, and that's the green manure. I'll keep that in the soil so that holds my soil fertility in place as the November rains come. And anything that was like a crop out vegetable, like a radish or a turnip, something that I actually physically pulled out all the organic matter from, then I tarp those up. Those ones I'll keep those covered. I don't want to have any bare soil anywhere going into November. I'll completely compromise my fertility. So that it's the same strategy for the entire year, really. I'm not going to have bare soil anywhere. I'm always going to keep things covered. So the white represents just leaving beds. I'm finishing up my season. And, you know, I'm doing some planting. I mean, I've got carrots that are covered. We would be planting in here somewhere. Where is it? Overwintered spinach. Yeah, here we go. I'm putting in overwintered spinach. So that's going to be my next year's crop. So that goes in first week of October. That's going to be cropped out by mid-March the next season. So I'm already thinking ahead for the next season. So even here, I'm still in rotation. But things that are just finishing, I'm not going to plant all those beds out again. I go back to putting microgreens on the rafters of my greenhouse. And so we would have taken the tomatoes out at this point, and then we've got our microgreens in there. So now we're essentially mirroring what we did in the spring. The greenhouses are going to be fully established. So tomatoes have been taken out. They were all clipped off at the base. The greenhouses are fully established as we approach October. And then everything tapers out on the field. This is kind of these are just some images of what it looks like later in the summer. Like everything is pumping off. You can see things going to flower. You know, I'll either cut those off and just leave the residue on the ground as a green manure, basically. You know, I've cut arugula multiple times. I've got some, this would have been an overwintered spinach that was planted. So things are just kind of finishing up. And then here at the end, that's kind of what it looks like. We've just got any bare soil covered, any crop residue just left on the ground. I'm not going to touch it. I don't do any tilling or anything like that in the fall. It's just not worth it for the soil. So that is essentially what our season looks like. So following this pattern, you can do $80,000, even more. The sky's the limit on what you can do. If you're interplanting, you're stacking, you've got indoor production with microgreens, the sky's the limit. We've continuously found year after year ways that we can increase production without taking on any more land or even really growing any different types of crops. It's just all about managing your timelines, understanding when things go in, understanding when they come out, understanding how you can overlap them and stack them, what you can put in vertically. And it's all about just understanding your surroundings and understanding the season. So I guess we'll just finish the session with questions and then we're done.
What challenges with diseases and like that kind of, high volume stuff that you have over?
No, I haven't. But again, my context is also important there. I'm in a high desert. I'm in a dry climate. We don't get a lot of tomato diseases, or diseases. Most common one would be tomatoes. As far as managing diseases with tomatoes go, grafting is usually the best way around that. Jean Martin probably talk about that in his workshop. We haven't. I mean, when I'm rotating crops, I'm rotating by families. So if I turned over an arugula bed, it'll go to a lettuce, might go to a spinach. Like I'm constantly rotating families. There's a few exceptions here and there, but generally I won't plant the same thing. Like even if a radish, I won't plant a radish and then follow with a turnip because they have a general broad family. The only time I would be in the summer, because when you've got quick days to maturity and they're in and out really quickly, you can get away with it a bit more. In the spring, less as much because they're in the ground so long. So generally I'm rotating my families, but the only exception would be in the summer when it's fast turnover and they're out quick.
How do you get your tomatoes to grow up in spring? You're clipping them on?
Twisting them. So we're taking all of our sucker branches, pruning those off. that's forcing them upwards, and we just twist them. As they grow, we're pruning them constantly. We spend, in the summer, we're spending about 10 hours a week just managing tomatoes. We're pruning, and we're just twisting them up the string. We don't use any fancy clips or anything. And then as they get to the top, which they are about by mid-August, they start to grow back down, and we keep pruning them, but they just hang. So it's essentially the same thing. And then after each set of fruit, we strip every single branch off to get that bare stem, so that when we go into interplant into the fall, we get that opportunity. Yeah, Rob? I don't do field tomatoes anymore. That's just my context. We always get this gnarly hailstorm in the middle of August that's wiped out my tomatoes 4 years in a row. So now I'm just at the point where I won't take the risk anymore. They're always in the greenhouse. But again, it's context.
Treated or non-treated lumber inside the greenhouse?
The greenhouse I treat with a linseed oil. So or anything. Like if I have wood in the greenhouse, it's a treated lumber for sure.
You buy it non-treated, then you
Well, depends. I just built a passive solar greenhouse that has wood on, but it's a manufactured lumber that's treated with something, and then any stuff that I put in the ground, I treat with a linseed oil. Yeah.
For those tomatoes with the strings, how are you securing the string? Are you like staking it in the ground?
Yep, bamboo stake, 3 foot long bamboo stake in the ground, leaving about 1.5 feet out, tying the string to that, and then the tomato first goes. It gets kind of twisted up along that bamboo. The bamboo is there just to keep the string static, and then it just twists up the string from there. We operate at about a 68 to 75% margin, profit margin. Our expenses are pretty low. In my one-day workshop, I break all of that down. But things like, as far as gross on what I know my farm produces and what I tell the government are different. And there's nothing illegal about that. That any small business person is going to have write-offs, right? So in my one-day workshop, I do break down all of my revenues, but I don't have on there like when I go for lunch or like all of the creative write-offs or asset write-offs that I can have. I break down fertility, labor, all the seeds, all that kind of stuff. And with that, it's about 68 to 75% margin, profit margin. But within my, what I can write off to the government, it's going to be way low. I'm going to show, a 20% net. That's just any small business person has an incentive to do that. So, you got a good accountant. And that's a context thing too, right? Your accountant for your jurisdiction is going to have different information about you on what you can and can't write off. And I would encourage you to write everything you can possibly write off. For us on the farm now, I essentially, because our farm, to be honest, makes too much money. For what we spend, we make too much money. So now I just reinvest in my farm. I built a $30,000 passive solar greenhouse this year because I wanted a greenhouse, but I needed a write-off. I bought a new vehicle this year. I needed a write-off. So, you learn those things as you operate in business.
Can you talk a little bit about operating as a certified grower, organic grower, and how that is affecting your business and what you've seen in the market as far as being certified organic and not?
It's a good question because it's another context question. I'm not certified organic. I have no interest in being certified organic, but it's not in my context. I've got my farm, because I'm urban, like this is on a street. There's no house on this plot. If people want to know about my farm, they can look over the fence, right? There's transparency built into the operation. Certified organic doesn't really offer me any value. It's not going to get me more sales because I know my customers. They know me. I'm a very small farm. I'm primarily focused on direct consumer markets. So it's trust that's there. If, however, I was a larger scale farm and I needed to sell to third party, then a certified organic is valuable. It's all about what's necessary for your context, and is that going to provide you value? Like, I buy certified organic, my girlfriend and I, when we go shopping and we're buying things that I don't grow and that I can't get locally, I'm going to prefer a certified organic product because that is a third party arbiter. So that's my level of trust. But for me, I know some farmers that are certified organic just to get in the club. And for me, a couple $1,000s a year isn't worth it just to be in the club, because I don't really care. My customers don't demand it, so it's not necessary for me. But again, I think it's important for growers that are selling to a third party to be certified organic. JM Fortier is certified organic. I'm not. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. John?
You didn't talk about basil when you planted. That's the issue when you're planting basil in relation to your tomatoes and the hoop house.
Yeah, I didn't because it's barely important because they were just interplanted. I did 2 rows 6 inches apart, 6 inches off the base of the tomato, right in the greenhouses with the tomato. They went in the same time as the tomatoes go in. Well, they went in a little bit later because if I was interplanting that row right up next to a field, like a quick crop, I didn't have the room then. I'd wait till that crop was out of the ground to put it in. Yeah, like yeah, it's around the same time as the tomatoes, but it isn't as important to get it in the ground as the tomatoes are.
Okay, my real question. If there was 1 or 2 tools that if you had to take something away and you have a choice, which ones would you take away? And if you had to pick one tool as your only tool, like going on an island like Naked Afraid or something.
Yeah. Oh, wow, that's a tough one. Well, I can tell you what I'd take if I was naked and afraid on an island. It would be a pitchfork, like a good digging fork. That would be the best tool for prepping beds, doing it all. When I was down in New Zealand at this guy Jody Roebuck's farm, who's a really cool bio-intensive farmer, his kit, basic like manual tool kit, was a wide digging fork, a rake. Actually, that was just those 2. He could do everything with those 2 tools. You could even get away with not using the rake by taking your fork upside down and kind of, moving around your soil this way to level it out. So I'd take a digging fork. If I had to pick a tool to lose, probably the landscape rake I could get away with not having because I could use something else to level out a bed. If I had to lose a big tool, I'd lose the BCS, the rototiller. I actually don't even use it anymore. The only time I use my BCS now is to turn over new plots. So I've got, if you guys, I encourage you to sign up for my YouTube channel. I've got a ton of videos up there. I've got one we filmed in Christchurch, New Zealand, which is 25 minutes of part of a presentation that I took out so that I can talk about more things in detail, but it's 25 minutes on how to convert a lawn into a farm, and I use a BCS tiller to do that. But in my context, as the size of my farm is now, I'm 1/3 of an acre. I could get away with not owning one. I could actually rent one for turning over plots, and then or borrow it from a farmer, or share it cooperatively with a group of growers, or something like that. I would lose the tiller. But if you're on anything more than a 1/3 of an acre, if you're a half-acre farm, intensively like this, you do need a walk-behind tractor, because to do that work manually is not worth the effort. But I can manually turn over beds at my scale, but it doesn't scale. To do that on a larger farm would just be way too much labor. So the machine would save you a lot of time in that situation.
How many batteries do you have for the drill on your tilter? Like how many batteries?
4.
Okay. 4.
Yeah, I always have 4 charged batteries. So that's a 20 volt DeWalt drill. I always have, every day I go to turn over beds, I have 4 charged batteries, and that's been enough. I'll even bring the charger with me. Like I might plug it into my neighbor's house in like rare circumstances of turning beds over, but 4 has been enough. Yeah, for the 1/3 of an acre. I might get another set of 2 just to always cover me. Yeah.
On these bare lots, and I heard you kind of answered, but you're drawing electrical from a neighbor. But if you need stuff for like drip irrigations for your timers.
Those are batteries. I'm not mooching anything off my neighbors. I've like in a rare circumstance, I might ask my neighbor, hey, would you mind if I plug my charger in there? All the day-to-day stuff on this farm, the irrigation, I have my own utility hooked up at this site. I paid $2,000 to set the water up at this site. I put in a big concrete well, and then had the city water put in. There's a meter on it. I pay for all that stuff. So, yeah, well, the energy, yeah, exactly. Yeah, day-to-day stuff is all myself.
Where do you get your big black tarps?
Those silage tarps, if you can get silage tarps, those are the best ones to use. Mine I just get from the hardware store. I don't have access to silage tarps. So I get these really big, they're black and silver on one side. They're about $200 for a 40 by 60. They're expensive, but they last many years. Like I haven't seen the end of the life of a lot of the tarps that I use.
Where do you store them?
We fold them up, and then we store them at the back of my property by my tool sheds. Yeah, some of them we keep on site. What I'm actually doing this year is trying something new. Is I'm making, at each site, I'm going to have a few tarps that are custom for each bed, so that in mid-season I can smother something out quick if I wanted, just one bed. But generally, yeah, I'll keep one or two. If at a site like this where I have lots of space, I'll keep tarps there, but generally it's all at my home base.
When you've lost plots before through
Yep.
various things, like you had to skate one up or something happened.
Yep.
What I've never heard you talk about was like when you go to a plot and say, we're going to farm this plot.
Yep.
Here's a lawn.
Yep.
Blow this thing away, we farm it for 4 years, and then we leave.
Yep. What happens?
What happens to that? What
Yep.
does that soil look like when you're gone?
Well, it looks a lot better than I left it, that's for sure. I've had to plant grass. I mean, I put that, like in the book, I talk about landowner arrangements, and there's a thing you can download off my website for free that's a sample contracts I use, and we usually put that in the contract. What happens when I leave? I've had to seed lawns. I've had to build. Usually what I promise is I'll just make it the way it was before I left. But what I've done in some cases is I've trained people to be really good gardeners just by osmosis because they're there. I just form out beds for them and they become really kick-ass homesteaders. In most cases, that's what's happened. And about 3 or 4 cases, I've reseeded lawn.
Well, the reason I ask is that if it's regenerative agriculture, then it would appear that some of the stuff that I've seen you work with at the beginning looks like my backyard.
Yeah.
Clay, sun-blasted,
Crap.
wasteland.
Crap soil. Yeah.
And then a couple of years later, you end up have built this fertility.
Yeah.
But you never really talked about that. I'm just wondering,
Yeah.
just because it doesn't serve your purposes to talk about that?
No, it's just that it's all about context, right? I don't own land. So, you could go down a rabbit hole of what is regenerative and what isn't, but I see it as regenerative that I'm repurposing these spaces to be producing food to feed the local community, first and foremost. I might only be there for 4 years. I have improved the soil. It is totally possible that somebody else could buy that house and turn that soil into a lawn and spray Roundup on it. That is totally possible. But I'm working within the context and the framework that I have best to my ability. So it's not my land, right? Most of my plots aren't my land. I don't own them. So I'm just doing the best I can with the context. So I don't know what can happen with it. I use it as best I can then, and that's it.
How easy is it to acquire the land?
Houses, very easy. In the sense that the simple economics of the day are that there's very few farmers in the world. I have never in my life, in my opinion, I've never seen a better time to get into farming than now. There's so few farmers in the world, and most farmers are old, and they're aging fast. The average age of a farmer in North America is 60, and less than 2% of people in the world work in agriculture. That means that of that 2%, because 2% represents farm workers, that represents everybody in agriculture, less than 2% of that are artisanal craftspeople who can manage and operate a farm, manage people, farm production, crop planting, you name it. It's so tiny that if people know you're skilled, you can farm anywhere. And when I just came back from a 1-month trip in New Zealand and Australia, and I saw most farmers that we talked to were landless farmers. And they had so many opportunities for land that they were turning people down all the time. And that's the situation I'm in, is I've got so much land offered to me, I can't possibly use it all. And it takes time to get there. Until you build a reputation as a farmer, you're not going to have those situations. But the important thing is that when you start, especially if you're starting your first plot of land, if it's in a visible place, you will build a lot of social equity very quickly and foster community relationships, and those will lead to so many opportunities. Because what happened on my farm is I was in about a 3-mile area. I had plots all over the place. What's happened over the years is that people have moved, they sold their houses. I keep consolidating my land base down to the point now I'm within a half a mile. All of my plots are within a half a mile. And that's just because it's like literally right now, my main guy, he's digging up my next door neighbor's yard. And they were the ones that sold me my house, so I do own a house now. But because people see what I do, after a couple of years they go, oh, you know what, maybe we should just get Curtis to do our yard. So it's getting to the point where in 5 years, I'll probably just be farming my street. It goes that way. And so even outside of the urban context, even if you look at some of the HM grazers today, like what Greg Judy writes about, when I was down in New Zealand hanging out with this guy, Jody Roebuck, who's a bio-intensive farmer, but he's also doing HM grazing of sheep. He's farming on leases. He's moving animals around from leases with electric fences. And the lease owners, now they see after a year of what their lots look like to the neighbors. We were there in the height of summer. Green, all his lots were green. Everybody else's were grazed to the bottom, brown. Now people go, well, why does Jody's look so good? And then they go, oh, because he's doing this HM thing, this holistic management thing. Okay, let's get Jody on our land. He's at a point now where he's got so many offers that he can't even manage it. He's got calls every week. He's turning people down constantly because he's showing value. He's showing, look, I will regenerate your landscape. I will build the soil. And essentially, I'm doing that too. I can build soil. And if somebody doesn't want me there for more than 3 years and they take it over as a garden, they've got really good soil. So yes, that's a little bit of a loss on my end. I've spent time building that soil. But you know what? I look at the other capital benefits. Okay, I might have lost the biological capital, but I've built huge amounts of social capital. I've built experience capital, all these other things that I think it's regenerative in that way. In the book, I talk about different arrangements. This one in particular, I have a 5-year lease on that. I pay $2,000 a year, and then I'll option to renew to 10 after that. A lot of them, it's just on a 3-year memorandum of understanding, where I'd like to get 3 years out of it. Sometimes things happen. A family member dies and they have to sell the house, and I have to leave. But it's all in my lease agreements that you can download for free on my website. And I will have a shotgun clause in here saying, okay, if I have to leave, this is what happens. Usually it's that I have to be able to finish the season. If I have to leave a plot mid-season, I'm screwed. Like that's bad. And I've never had that. That's never happened once. Anytime somebody said, you got to leave, they tell me at the beginning of the season and then I'm gone at the end. And there's a lot of nuances there. It's just, getting to know that person and figuring out, is there a communication here, proper communication? But getting everything in writing. What happens if this happens? What happens if that happens?
I guess, sir, the vandalism, do you ever have an issue with that?
Never. This plot's fenced in well. We actually caught 3 bums partying in our greenhouse this summer. This spring. But they didn't do anything. They were just drinking beers and doing bong hits in the greenhouse. Like that was it. Like, there was no vandalism. They were just partying. We said, "Hey guys, get the hell out of here." But other than that, no. We've been, and I attribute that to just getting to know our neighbors. Everybody in every community that I'm farming in knows me very well. They support us at the farmers market. They look after our plots like it was their own. I get a phone call if people see things that are amiss, but I do that just by giving vegetables to my neighbors and getting to know people in the area. So we've never had problems.
Can you touch on your compost system, hot or cold compost, making your own, sourcing it somewhere else?
So I source compost. I make my own. I don't really do anything special about compost. I do static piles. I don't turn them. I do high amounts of carbon. I do static pile, layered, and then when the pile doesn't cook anymore, so I do hot composting. When it will cook down to a point where it's not going to reduce down anymore, I take shovelfuls of finished compost, which usually have worms in them, spread that out, water it in heavy, and I tarp it for about 3 or 4 weeks. The worms finish it. That's what I've done essentially. But I buy about $500 of compost a year just because I can't make enough. Because I only put compost in the beginning. That's all I have that I can manage. Yeah.
All your waste from every single plot gets composted on plot?
Yep. Yeah. Well, this mostly, yes. This plot, no. Because this plot, I'm not allowed to have a compost on it. Yeah, it sucks. But No, it's my own, the landowner doesn't want me to have compost piles. So in this case, when we have residue left over, we do one or two things. We either spread it on the soil in our when our tomatoes are in the greenhouse and just let it decompose and dry, so it just becomes a thick layer of mulch, or we actually have to put it in the green bin. So that sucks, but it's just kind of a reality of my situation.
Yeah, when somebody comes in with low skill and trains with you, generally, how long does it take on average for someone to really wrap their head around it?
My main worker, Mark, he's dialed now. He's dialed after a year. He started with me a year ago. I've been away from the farm for 7 weeks. I haven't had to micromanage a single thing he's done. So he can pretty much run it. But before I hired him, he took my online course. He had watched all my videos. He was pretty versed in the stuff. But yeah, now he can pretty much. My plan is to pass it off to him and start another type of enterprise. So yeah, about a year. Get to you in a sec. Sorry.
Talk about a few models that you've seen with fruits and trees.
Yeah, we've done fruit trees. Yeah, when my first 2 years, we had a cherry apricot, we had an apple tree. We've done that. The economics of it just aren't really that great. What I did is I gave a lot of those fruit trees to a nonprofit. There's a nonprofit in Kelowna that is doing this thing, basically. I didn't really give them to them. I just stopped using them, and then they took them over. There's a nonprofit in Kelowna called the Okanagan Fruit Tree project, something like that, and that's what they do. They pick and sell the stuff and donate it, and so it's just people coming in on volunteer labor. The way we used to do it, it just didn't work out economically. We'd go in and prune these trees, come and harvest it. It was a lot of work for very little return. So I think there is a model there. I think there's potential with it. I just preferred doing this because it was way more lucrative for my inputs, basically. Yeah, Chris. So Chris is saying, what would I do if I had to 10x my business? And that's a really good question, because it's important to understand that this thing doesn't just scale exponentially. You can't just 10x my farm and say, oh, Curtis, if you can do 100 grand on a third of an acre, why don't you just do an acre and do 300 grand? Yeah, it doesn't really work that way, because it's all about what your market saturation point is primarily. Like, how many greens can I sell to the restaurants in my local area? Only so much. So if I had the 10x, I'd have to start outsourcing. I'd have to start delivering further, which would basically take my margins down. And all of the research I've done on scaling businesses is that you go to a model where you're delivering, your margins go down, but there's sort of this spot where you've got really high margins here and really high margins up here, but anywhere in between is kind of like this period where you're just spending money. So you could scale it to go all the way up here if I had a lot of systems and spent $1 million to get all that happening, but I'm not prepared to do that. So if I were to scale, I'd diversify. If I were to go to a 1 acre farm tomorrow, I would grow a lot more different variety of crops so that I could engage in more markets. So I'd go back to a CSA, which I'd done for 4 or 5 years. I would do a larger farmer's market, and keep growing high value stuff, but I'd have to diversify my crop profile. And so there's sort of a spot where, if any of you guys go and check out Chris Thoreau's workshop on microgreens, which I highly recommend, Chris and I have talked about this in the past, where the less diversity you have with crops and products, the more diversity with customers you need. The more diversity you have with products, the less customer diversity you need. So for example, like a CSA, you can have a large crop diversity and less customer diversity. You've got one type of customer. But if you're going to be like Chris and just sell 4 crops of microgreens, you need to have a lot of customer diversity. So it's kind of switching diversity on either end of the scale. So I would probably diversify my crops first and then look into other markets. Well, I'm looking at vertically integrating my farm into a distribution hub, buying a distribution hub business and then vertically integrating the farm to grow high-value greens for that, and then continue to be a broker to buy from other farmers and sell as a box program in the city. So that's kind of what I'd like to do. If I can do it, I don't exactly know. But right now, this works. I don't really want to scale my farm anymore. I'm at the sweet spot. I've scaled it. I've been 2.5 acres before, where we did a lot more in revenue, but had a very, very low gross, very low profit margin. So right now, at my current size, based on my market conditions and my bioregion, 1/3 of an acre is very sweet, where it's a high profit margin with the least amount of work. So I don't want to scale it unless I get into some other enterprise.
So I got one more. Not your book.
All right.
Okay. First year Seasonality grower, wife's seeding pelleted seeds at home right now as we speak. Transplant spacing. You do 9 rows of lettuce.
Salanova 4 rows, 6-inch centers. So that means that they're off, right? So 1 row, 6 inches like this. The next row is diamond planted from that. Yeah. For a 30-inch bed, that works good. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, maybe we'll take one more and then we'll wrap up for the day. We'll do 2 more? We'll do the both of you guys. Yeah, at the back. Pardon me? Oh yeah, I got rodents, man. I got all kinds of pest problems. I mean, I had to borrow my friend's pellet gun this year and take one out myself. I've trapped them. Yeah, totally. I mean, we could talk for hours about all the pest problems that I've had, but farming, you got pests. Like there's no silver bullet. I mean, good fencing, which isn't rodents, but trapping and staying consistently on it. Like I was at Singing Frogs Farm in Sebastopol a couple months ago, and they had really, really bad field mice problems. And they just had to consistently trap. They were looking at, and Rob Kaiser is a pretty cool guy. He kind of broke down the economics of it. He said, I'm getting about $200 of crop damage a week from these rodents. So I'm better off in making somebody work 4 to 8 hours a week on trapping those things and offsetting that cost. And he just said over the time period that he'd done that, they'd mitigated the crop damage. So it's just, you've got to stay on top of it. And you've got to get, prepared to try different things and get your hands dirty. Okay, one more question and then we'll finish up.
Would you structure your overwinter beds differently in somewhere like Southern California where you have
Yes,
warm weather?
absolutely. Yeah, and again, it's all context. I can only show you what I do. Yes, absolutely. I'm not exactly sure what that looked like. It might just be when I said I start my overwintered spinach in October, it might be for you starting it in end of November or something. And yeah, it'd be a different strategy. But I know people do it here because I've seen it. I've seen people overwintering greens and crops in California. So it's definitely being done. Okay, guys, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for coming.